Section 1. The World of the Griffins. Setting the stage. Let's settle into this slowly. Picture a quiet street, elm trees, modest two-story houses, a broken basketball hoop in someone's driveway that nobody has touched in 3 years. The lawns are mostly okay. Mostly. There is one stretch of pavement in this fictional Rhode Island neighborhood, a little road called Spooner Street, that sits at the very center of one of the longest-running animated comedies in television history. And the family that lives at number 31 on that street has, over the course of more than 2 decades, gotten into more bizarre, unhinged, heartfelt, completely inexplicable situations than perhaps any fictional family ever committed to animation. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. Something like 22 million people were already sitting on their couches when it began, and what they saw was a cartoon unlike anything that had been on television before it. A fat, cheerful, thoroughly dim man named Peter Griffin, his patient and capable wife Lois, their 3 kids, and a talking dog who ordered martinis and considered himself the intellectual apex of the household. There was also a baby, but not an ordinary baby. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and cut his teeth working on animated shows at Hanna-Barbera, spending time on productions like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. Before Family Guy existed in any official capacity, MacFarlane had made 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. If you track those down and watch them, the DNA of the Griffin family is right there, a heavyset, good-natured man and his articulate dog navigating the world together. MacFarlane took those 2 characters, built a whole family around them, changed their names, sharpened their edges, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox saw something in it. They gave him the green light, and from that pitch came one of the most culturally influential animated shows the world has ever seen. The town where all of this takes place is called Quahog. It sits in Newport County, Rhode Island, and it is a completely fictional place, though it borrows some visual cues from the real city of Providence. The name is pronounced K-O-Hog, and it is the name of a clam native to the northeastern coast of America, which tracks perfectly because the whole show has this salty, slightly grimy New England atmosphere underneath all the absurdity. The town has a population that the show has described at various points as somewhere around 800 people, which is an absolutely tiny number for a place that seemingly has a full news station, multiple hospitals, a brewery, a performing arts center, and at least one giant anthropomorphic chicken wandering around causing property damage. The founding of Quahog, as explained in the Season 7 episode called Peter's Progress, is its own ridiculous story. According to the lore the show established, Quahog was founded by a man named Griffin Peterson, who happened to be an ancestor of Peter Griffin. Griffin Peterson had been exiled from England by King Stuart III, and eventually wound up in America, where he was granted control over the land that would become Quahog after beating the king in a talent contest. There is also a competing myth woven into the show's history, the version that was taught in local schools, which says the town was actually founded by a man named Miles Chatterbox Musket, with help from a magical talking clam. The show never fully commits to which version is true, and that kind of cheerful inconsistency is one of its most endearing qualities. It does not take its own mythology too seriously, but the mythology is there, and it goes deep. The Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street. They have neighbors on either side and across the road who have become as much a part of the show's identity as the main family itself. To the right, Glenn Quagmire, a man of extraordinarily flexible morality and impeccable grooming, who works as an airline pilot and speaks almost exclusively in variations of a single catchphrase that has somehow never fully grown old. Across the street, Joe Swanson, a police officer and combat veteran who uses a wheelchair and possesses the physical strength of about 6 non-wheelchair-using people when sufficiently motivated. And for several years before he got his own spin-off series, Cleveland Brown, a gentle, soft-spoken man who was perhaps the most reasonable person on the entire street, which is not a high bar, but he cleared it consistently. Peter Griffin himself is a man who deserves a slow, careful introduction because he is one of the most complicated comic creations in animated television history, which is a strange thing to say about a character who once spent an entire episode convinced he had discovered a new country in his own backyard. Peter is large. He has a round belly, a square jaw with a significant underbite, and glasses that somehow always look slightly askew. He works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, a job he got somewhat accidentally and held through a combination of luck, minimal effort, and the universe's apparent indifference to natural selection. He went to a bar called the Drunken Clam with his friends. He loved television. He had strong opinions about movies, most of them wrong. He was the kind of person who would gesture dramatically at the television and announce that some beloved classic film insists upon itself, with all the conviction of someone who has recently discovered the concept of having opinions. Lois Griffin is the fulcrum the whole family balances on. She grew up wealthy. Her maiden name was Pewterschmidt, and her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a cold, calculating billionaire who has disapproved of Peter from the moment he first met him and has never really stopped making that disapproval known. Lois chose Peter anyway. She plays piano. She is patient in the way that a person can only be patient when they have made a deep, foundational commitment to someone and have decided that love is a long game. She is also, when pushed past a certain point, capable of a kind of focused intensity that is almost frightening in its efficiency. Meg is 17 years old for the duration of the show's run, which is one of those convenient, animated Showtime situations where nobody really ages. She goes to James Woods Regional High School, which is named after the actor James Woods, who guest starred in multiple episodes as a version of himself that the show treated with gleeful irreverence. Meg wears a pink beanie hat, has brown hair, and spends most of her time trying to fit in somewhere, anywhere, while the universe conspires against her in ways that often go well beyond comedic and into the territory of genuinely moving, if you watch closely enough. Chris Griffin is Meg's younger brother, a heavyset, sweet-natured teenager who has inherited his father's intellectual limitations, but not his father's particular flavor of chaos. Chris is more gentle than Peter. He is interested in art. He has a talent for drawing that occasionally surfaces as a genuine storyline. He is also deeply susceptible to bad advice, which, given the people around him, means he receives an enormous amount of it. And then there is Stewie. Stewie Griffin is 1 year old. He has a football-shaped head, a British accent of refined theatrical quality, and, during the show's early seasons, an unshakable dedication to two goals: the murder of his mother and the conquest of all human civilization. He built ray guns in his crib. He designed mind control devices. He constructed time machines. He spoke about geopolitical theory while sitting in a high chair eating strained peas, and the contrast between the image and the words coming out of his mouth created a kind of comedy that nobody had really seen before. He is, in those early seasons, one of the most genuinely original characters in the history of animation. Brian Griffin is the family dog. He walks on two legs, drives a car, writes fiction, holds strong opinions about literature and politics, drinks white wine and dry martinis, and considers himself the most sophisticated member of the household, a claim that is both largely accurate and chronically overstated. Brian is Peter's best friend in the deepest sense of that word. He is the voice of reason, the steadying hand, the person who looks at whatever catastrophe Peter has just set in motion and says something dry and precise about it before quietly helping to fix things. These 6 people and Brian and their extended community of neighbors, co-workers, enemies, recurring strangers, giant chickens, and the occasional literal personification of death have produced over 2 decades of stories. What follows is a long, slow, detailed walk through some of the most memorable, most unhinged, and most strangely touching of those stories. Get comfortable. We are going to be here for a while. Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're watching from. And if this kind of content is your thing, long, slow storytelling about shows you grew up with, subscribe. It genuinely helps. Now let's get into it. Section 2. Peter Griffin's most spectacular disasters. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world with complete confidence in decisions that are objectively terrible, and who somehow, through sheer density of conviction, manages to pull other people into the orbit of those decisions without ever quite acknowledging that things have gone wrong. Peter Griffin is the ultimate version of this person. He has, across more than 2 decades of television, managed to become a founding member of a religion, declared his property an independent nation, coached a little league team into a minor local scandal, joined the New England Patriots, and started more bar fights with a giant chicken than any reasonable accounting of events could explain. He is a disaster engine. He runs on catastrophe. Let's start with one of his most formative professional experiences. For most of the show's early run, Peter worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, run by a man named Mr. Weed. The job suited Peter in the sense that it required very little skill and had extremely limited consequences for error, since the worst thing that could reasonably happen was that a toy came out slightly wrong. Even in this forgiving environment, Peter managed to create situations of escalating complication. He once attempted to host a fundraiser for the factory that spiraled into something resembling a small riot. He got into philosophical disagreements with coworkers that made no sense from any starting position, and then Mr. Weed died fairly abruptly in the middle of a dinner scene, having choked on a dinner roll, and Peter found himself unemployed. What followed was a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, and this was, in many ways, where the show found its stride. The brewery became the backdrop for a new category of Peter adventures. Working around beer meant Peter had easy access to his primary interest in life. It also meant he had coworkers who were equally susceptible to whatever ridiculous scheme he arrived at that week. His boss at the brewery, Angela, was a hardened, tired woman who had long since given up expecting competence from Peter and had settled into a kind of weary resignation that most people who know Peter very well eventually arrive at. But the job adventures are almost a footnote compared to the neighborhood adventures, because so much of what defines Peter as a character is his relationship to the specific geography of Spooner Street. He is a deeply territorial creature. He has at various points built a miniature golf course in his backyard, converted his house into a place of business, and fought pitched battles with local authorities over property lines. In one of the show's most beloved running storylines, Peter discovers that due to a historical survey error, a small section of his property technically does not fall within the city limits of Quahog. This means it is not subject to city laws. His response is immediate, enthusiastic, and thoroughly thought through in the wrong direction. He declares it an independent nation called Pretoria. Pretoria lasts approximately as long as you would expect, which is to say not very long at all, but the arc of its existence is magnificent. Peter designs a flag. He prints currency. He attempts to negotiate with the actual United States government regarding Pretoria's political status. He annexes Joe Swanson's pool by pushing the boundary marker a few feet, which is the kind of geopolitical aggression that, from a man of Peter's height and wingspan, is actually fairly intimidating in person. The U.S. government's response is to cut off all utility services to the property, which Peter had not accounted for, and Pretoria collapses within days. The flag is quietly retired. The currency becomes a curiosity. The Swansons get their pool back. This pattern, Peter identifies a problem, invents a solution so wrong that it creates 17 new problems, and then the whole thing collapses in a way that is somehow Peter-shaped repeats itself across the show's entire run with remarkable consistency. He once discovered he was part black, based on genealogical research of questionable accuracy, and spent an episode exploring what that meant to him with a level of self-involvement that the people around him found exhausting. He once found out he was technically Irish royalty and spent time in Ireland experiencing what he imagined Irish culture was like before discovering that his understanding of Irish culture was assembled almost entirely from cartoons and cereal boxes. One of the great recurring structural elements in Peter's storyline is his relationship with work and ambition. Peter occasionally gets ideas about improving his circumstances. These ideas never come from careful planning. They come from a flash of something that feels, to Peter, like inspiration, and which is in practice the intellectual equivalent of someone pointing at a map and saying, "I'll go there," without checking whether that territory is a desert or an ocean. In one episode, Peter decides he wants to be taken seriously as a music producer. In another, he pivots to acting. In still another, he becomes briefly convinced he is a superhero, a conclusion he arrived at after surviving something he probably should not have survived and misinterpreting the cause. His friendship with Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, before Cleveland got his own show and moved away, was the emotional spine of many of his best episodes. The four of them at the Drunken Clam, sitting in a booth that seemed to be permanently reserved for them by unspoken agreement, talking about nothing important, in exactly the way that people who are genuinely comfortable with each other talk about nothing important. It was one of the show's most effective pieces of characterization, because it happened quietly, in the background of other things, and felt completely real. The road trip episodes that Peter had with his friends are among the show's most purely enjoyable episodes. In the Season 10 episode Cool Hand Peter, The four of them head to New Orleans on a road trip that starts as a vacation and rapidly becomes a legal situation when they are pulled over by a corrupt sheriff in Louisiana and thrown in jail. The episode draws explicitly from the classic 1967 film Cool Hand Luke, with the friends cast in the role of prisoners trying to outwit a system designed to keep them trapped. What makes it work is that the chemistry between Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, by that point in the show's run, is so well established that you believe, even in an absurd situation, that these four men would operate as a team. They bicker. They disagree about tactics. But when the moment comes to actually work together, they do. And it is satisfying in the specific way that watching people who genuinely like each other accomplish something is always satisfying. Peter's relationship with food deserves its own chapter in any serious accounting of his character. He ate constantly and enthusiastically, and the show used this not just as a visual gag but as a window into his personality. Peter ate the way he approached everything without moderation, without concern for consequence, and with a kind of pure, concentrated joy that was almost endearing in its simplicity. There is something honest about a person who has identified what makes them happy and pursues it with zero irony. Peter was not embarrassed about loving food. He was not performing enjoyment. He was actually, genuinely, completely happy eating a large bowl of something at the kitchen table. And the show captured that happiness with a specificity that made it funny rather than simply absurd. His capacity for physical catastrophe was also remarkable. Peter tripped down staircases in ways that should have hospitalized him permanently. He walked into sliding glass doors. He drove his car into things that cars should not drive into. The show developed a recurring gag where Peter would injure his knee, specifically in a way that seemed to produce an exact same sound every time, and would then spend an extended period on the ground, making the same noise over and over while holding the injured area. The joke was not subtle, it did not need to be. The commitment was the joke, and the show committed so thoroughly that it became one of the more iconic running bits in the series. What kept all of this from becoming exhausting was the show's understanding, particularly in its better seasons, that Peter needed to care about something. Not in a way he could articulate, not in a way that translated into consistent, responsible behavior, but underneath the chaos, the selfishness, the complete indifference to property law, and the sheer physical comedy of a man his size doing things his body was not designed to do. Underneath all of it was a guy who loved his family. Who would, when something genuinely mattered, show up? Who could, in the right episode, have a moment with Lois or with one of his kids that landed with an emotional weight that surprised you because you had just watched him do something completely ridiculous for 20 minutes? That tension between the Peter who was capable of genuine feeling and the Peter whose every instinct led him somewhere disastrous, that was the engine the show ran on for years. Section 3. Stewie Griffin and the Evil Genius Years. There is something that happens when you watch the first season of Family Guy after years away from it. You sit down expecting to remember it, and then Stewie appears on screen, and you realize that you had actually forgotten how genuinely strange and special the original version of this character was. Stewie Griffin in Season 1 is an experience. He is a baby. He is physically a baby round head, tiny hands, a diaper, a yellow shirt with a red collar that he wears in every episode, sitting in a high chair getting spoonfuls of pureed food that he finds deeply beneath him. And while all of that is happening, while Lois is dabbing his face with a cloth and making the sounds that people make to babies, Stewie is calmly and precisely describing his plans for global domination, in a British accent, with the vocabulary of someone who has read extensively and retained everything. The comedy here is architectural. It is built on contrast in the most complete way possible. You need the image, the baby, the bib, the mashed peas to be absolutely convincing as a baby image. And you need the dialogue to be absolutely convincing as the dialogue of a menacing genius. If either side of that equation is off, the joke collapses. But when it works, when the gap between the visual and the audio is exactly right, it produces a kind of laughter that is almost involuntary. It sneaks up on you, because the situation is absurd, but Stewie plays it completely straight. His relationship with Lois in those early seasons was the central dynamic of his character. He wanted her dead. This was not a fleeting feeling or an occasional dark thought. It was a primary life goal, sitting right alongside world domination on his to-do list, probably alphabetically filed under M for matricide. He attempted to carry out this goal in a variety of increasingly elaborate ways across the first 3 seasons. He built weapons, actual, functional weapons, including ray guns, mind control devices, and various machines that seemed to harness forces that real physics could not fully account for. He set traps. He wrote detailed plans in notebooks he kept hidden in his room. He would occasionally come within 1 or 2 steps of actually executing his scheme before something, usually Peter doing something stupid in the immediate vicinity, derailed the whole operation. Stewie's first time machine appeared in the Season 1 episode, Mind Over Murder. He built it specifically to avoid teething, which is the most relatable reason anyone has ever built a time machine. The idea of a baby constructing temporal displacement technology to skip past the part of infancy where your gums ache is so specific and so perfectly pitched that it captures everything the character was in those early episodes. His genius was not abstract. It was always in service of something immediate, something that mattered to him right now, in his present situation, as a 1-year-old navigating a world that treated him like an infant. The weapons he built were extraordinary in their specificity. He once built a shrink ray. He built a device to control the weather. He assembled a mind-controlling helmet. He constructed working robots. He had, at various points, actual missiles and actual laser cannons stored in a room that everyone around him treated as a nursery. The show maintained this joke through a very specific kind of selective blindness on the part of the adult characters. Lois and Peter would look into Stewie's room and see, essentially, what they expected to see. The audience saw the actual contents, and the actual contents were terrifying. Brian was the one character who could hear Stewie clearly and understand him. Everyone else either could not process what the baby was saying or interpreted his elaborate, threatening speeches as baby babble, which is perhaps the funniest ongoing misunderstanding in the show's entire history. Brian understood him, which meant Brian was complicit in a way, aware of what Stewie was planning, aware of what Stewie was capable of, and choosing, for reasons of friendship and a kind of philosophical resignation, to remain involved anyway. Their friendship grew slowly and organically across the first 3 seasons and became one of the show's greatest assets. Brian was not Stewie's moral conscience in any conventional sense, because Stewie did not particularly want or need a moral conscience. Brian was more like a sparring partner, someone who could match Stewie's intelligence, give him someone worth talking to, and occasionally point out with dry, precise accuracy when one of Stewie's plans had a fatal flaw. Stewie did not always listen, but he appreciated being talked to like an equal, which almost nobody else in his life did. The evil plots Stewie constructed were elaborate enough that unpacking them becomes its own pleasure. He once attempted to steal a toy called the Mind Wipe Ray from a rival baby genius named Bertram, who appeared intermittently throughout the show as Stewie's primary intellectual peer and secondary archenemy. Bertram was, in many ways, the mirror version of Stewie, equally brilliant, equally ruthless, and completely without the complications that Stewie's relationship with Brian and with his own developing sense of humanity gradually introduced to his character. Bertram was what Stewie could have been without those complications. That made him genuinely threatening in a way that most of Stewie's other adversaries were not. The 2-part episode from Season 6, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, is the closest the show ever came to paying off the original version of the character in a definitive way. In the first part, Stewie actually goes through with it. He follows through on the plan he has been constructing in one form or another since the pilot episode. He apparently kills Lois. She goes overboard on a cruise ship. The family mourns. Peter is arrested for the murder, and Stewie, having achieved his primary goal, sets about accomplishing the second one. He takes over the world. He installs himself as a global dictator. He commands armies. He runs the whole operation from a high-backed chair with the supreme confidence of someone who has been planning this since before he could walk. The second episode deals with the fallout. Lois, who survived, returns and fights back, leading to a confrontation that is dramatic, genuinely exciting, and surprisingly emotional given that it is an animated comedy involving a baby and his mother. Stewie faces her. She is terrifying. He is terrifying. And then the twist arrives. The entire sequence was a simulation. Stewie had run a computer program to model what would happen if he killed Lois and took over the world. None of it actually happened. The present-day reality snapped back. And from that point on, the show never really returned to the original Stewie in any serious, sustained way. It became, in retrospect, a farewell to the version of the character that fans had fallen in love with. The writers, including McFarlane, had concluded that the evil baby arc had been taken to its natural conclusion. They felt, and there is some validity to this argument, that Stewie had nowhere left to go within the confines of the villain role. Every scheme would be a version of a scheme he had already run. Every plan would echo earlier plans. So they pivoted. The Stewie who emerged on the other side of that pivot is a different character. Softer, more emotionally complex, more interested in his relationship with Brian, in understanding his own identity, in the texture of his feelings about the world. He still had the time machine. It became a central plot device for years of Brian and Stewie adventures, but the malice was largely gone. What replaced it was a character capable of warmth and vulnerability that the original Stewie was not. The famous Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, where the two of them get locked in a bank vault over a weekend, would not have been possible with the original character. Because the original Stewie could not have the conversation that the vault forces them to have. He could not have revealed, as he does in that episode, the depth of what Brian means to him. The original Stewie loved nothing except his schemes. The later Stewie loved Brian. Whether the trade was worth it depends entirely on what you valued most about the character. But the evil genius years remain, by any measure, some of the most creative and fearlessly strange television that animated comedy has ever produced. A baby, with a British accent, plotting the end of civilization from a crib surrounded by ray guns, and meaning every word of it. Section 4. Brian Griffin, the dog who wanted to matter. Brian Griffin's story across the entire run of the show is one of the most interesting character journeys in animated television, and also one of the most uneven. In the beginning, he was the character that held the show together. By the end, he had become a controversial figure in his own fictional universe and in the very real universe of people who argued about animated characters online. But we should not start at the end. We should start at the beginning, because the beginning was genuinely special. In seasons 1 through 3, Brian was the emotional anchor of the Griffin household. He was intelligent in a way that felt real, not performed intelligence. Not a character who was smart in the way that shows signal smartness by having someone wear glasses and reference obscure facts, but actually read widely, thought carefully, spoke precisely intelligent. He had a dry wit that matched the show's general register perfectly. When Peter was careening toward disaster, Brian was the one watching from the side with the specific expression of a person who knows exactly how this is going to end and has already accepted it. He was also a failed writer, which was one of the most humanizing details in his character design. Brian had been working on a novel for years. A real novel. Something that mattered to him. Something he believed in. And something he could never quite finish or get to a place he was satisfied with. This is a painfully recognizable experience for anyone who has ever had creative ambitions and encountered the gap between the vision and the execution. Brian lived in that gap. He talked about the novel. He defended the novel against skeptics. He presented the novel's existence as evidence of his seriousness as an artist. But he never finished it, and part of him knew it, and that knowing sat underneath everything he said about himself. He drank too much. This was established early and treated honestly rather than as a punchline. Brian ordered martinis with the ease of someone for whom drinking was not a special occasion but a baseline, and the show acknowledged this without turning it into a very special episode moment. It was simply part of who he was, one of his flaws, alongside his romantic misadventures and his occasional pretension and his deep, carefully maintained, unrequited feelings for Lois. The thing about Brian and Lois is that it was played with enormous restraint in the early seasons. He did not announce his feelings. He did not make moves. There were moments careful, specific moments where his expression said something that his words did not, and then the show moved on. It was the kind of romantic subtext that respects the intelligence of the audience by trusting them to see it without being told it is there. His relationship with Peter was the engine of his early characterization. They were an unlikely best friendship that made complete sense. Peter needed someone who could see through him clearly enough to tell him the truth, even when Peter was going to ignore the truth. Brian needed someone whose chaos was never cruel, whose disasters were always well-intentioned, who saw Brian not as the family dog but as his best friend. They sat on the couch and watched television together. They went to the bar together. When Peter had an idea so bad it was almost beautiful in its badness, Brian went along with it while simultaneously explaining exactly why it would fail. In Season 3, there is an episode called Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows, in which Brian develops a relationship with an elderly, bitter shut-in named Pearl who lives near the Griffin house and has closed herself off from the world. It is a genuinely touching episode, one that treats loneliness as a real subject rather than a setup for jokes, and Brian's role in it as someone who sees Pearl's anger as grief rather than nastiness, and who sits with her in it rather than trying to fix it, showed the full emotional range the character was capable of when given the material. His road to adventures with Stewie became, across the show's middle seasons, the clearest expression of his best qualities. When he was traveling with Stewie when they were navigating Nazi Germany, or hopping between alternate universes, or trying to get back from somewhere they had accidentally ended up, Brian was at his finest. Patient, resourceful, funny in the dry way that is the hardest kind of funny to sustain, and genuinely affectionate toward Stewie in the way that long friendships produce a quiet, practiced tenderness. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie is, by nearly any assessment, the finest piece of television the show ever produced, and it is primarily a Brian episode. The premise is as simple as television gets two characters, locked in a room, talking. No cutaway gags, no other characters, no musical numbers. Just Brian and Stewie in a bank vault over a weekend, forced by circumstance to have the conversations that the rest of their lives usually allowed them to avoid. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box in that vault because there are times when the weight of his life, its failures, its disappointments, the gap between who he wanted to be and who he is becomes too much to carry. Stewie's response to this revelation is one of the most carefully written pieces of dialogue in the show's entire run. He does not minimize it. He does not fix it. He asks Brian to stay, and he says it in a way that means something. The episode won the show significant critical praise and demonstrated that the format, stripped down to its essentials, could produce something genuinely moving. It also made the character's later decline feel more painful than it might have otherwise, because you saw what he was capable of and then watched the writers make choices that moved away from it. In the Season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller, Stewie encourages Brian to write a self-help book. The book, called Wish It, Want It, Do It, becomes an enormous success, and Brian, having achieved the kind of public recognition he had always told himself he wanted, becomes almost instantly monstrous. He is arrogant in a way that is painful to watch. He is dismissive of Stewie, who believed in him when nobody else did, and the dismissal is not the performed irritation of someone who is privately grateful, it is genuine contempt. The episode is difficult to watch because it is clearly intentional, clearly designed to show Brian at his worst, and yet the show does not follow through on the indictment. Brian does not learn the lesson the episode seemed to be building toward. He does not change. This became the defining problem of the character in later seasons. The show would bring Brian to the edge of a genuine reckoning with who he had become, and then pull back before the reckoning could happen. The Quagmire speech, in which Quagmire lists in painful detail every way that Brian has failed to be the person he presents himself as, is the most famous version of this pattern. Quagmire says everything. He is thorough and precise and absolutely correct. And Brian's behavior in the episodes that follow changes not at all. The death arc in Season 12 was the show at its most provocative, and whether you think it was a legitimate creative risk or a transparent ratings manipulation depends somewhat on your feelings about the show in general at that point. In the episode Life of Brian, Brian is hit by a car and killed. The show treats it as a real death. The Griffin family mourns. Stewie, whose time machine Stewie has just destroyed in a separate story within the same episode, has no way to go back and fix it. A new dog named Vinny is introduced as a replacement. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie encounters his past self at a Christmas gathering, borrows the return pad from that version of himself, goes back to the moment before Brian was hit, and saves his life. Brian was back. Everything reset. The death, the mourning, Vinny, all of it was undone in a matter of weeks. The fan reaction was volcanic, and not entirely in the direction the show's producers might have hoped. Many viewers were not primarily devastated that Brian had come back to life. They were frustrated by what the arc revealed about the show's relationship with consequences. If nothing stays changed, nothing matters. If every reset button is available, every dramatic moment is ultimately provisional. The show had done this before the Stewie kills Lois simulation being the most prominent earlier example, but Brian's death felt bigger because Brian felt more real than most things on the show. And bringing him back so quickly said, in the clearest possible way, that the show was not actually interested in the weight of what it had just done. What matters when you look at Brian's full story is that for a long time he was genuinely extraordinary. The show created a talking dog who read novels and made cocktails and cared deeply and silently about the people he lived with. That is a remarkable thing to have made. And even in the episodes that came later, even in the ones where the character's worst qualities were on full display, there were moments, brief, carefully written moments when the original Brian surfaced. When he said something to Stewie that reminded you of who they were to each other, when he made a choice that reflected the loyalty the early seasons had built into him, those moments proved the character was still there, underneath everything else, just not always given the space to be. Section 5. The Road to Saga. Brian and Stewie take on the world. If you had to identify the single creative strand that runs through all of Family Guy's best work and ties it together with something approaching thematic consistency, it would be the Road to episodes. These are the show's best argument for itself, proof that it could do something no other animated sitcom was doing, and that when given the right material and the right characters, it could do it extraordinarily well. The concept came from Seth MacFarlane's genuine admiration for a series of classic Hollywood films. Between 1940 and 1962, Bing Crosby and Bob Hope made 7 Road to movies: Road to Singapore, Road to Zanzibar, Road to Morocco, and several others in which they played a pair of cheerful, somewhat incompetent travelers who kept ending up in exotic locations and getting into trouble while making musical jokes. They were light, breezy, cheerful films built entirely on the chemistry between two performers who clearly enjoyed working together. MacFarlane loved them, and he designed the Family Guy Road to episodes as a direct homage, with Brian and Stewie standing in for Hope and Crosby. The first Road to episode, Road to Rhode Island, aired in May of 2000 as part of the show's second season. It is a road trip story in the most literal sense. Brian goes to pick Stewie up from his grandparents, they lose their plane tickets, and they have to make their way back to Quahog on their own. The episode has a specific musical quality that the regular show does not. It has its own version of the opening theme, its own musical cues, and it features an original song, Road to Rhode Island, set to the melody of Road to Morocco from the 1942 film of the same name. The song is funny and musically accomplished and establishes the Road to format as its own thing within the show, a special occasion, something different, something worth paying attention to. But the episode also does something the show did not always have time to do. It takes Brian's backstory seriously. Brian visits the farm where he was born, looking for his mother, and he discovers that she has died and been stuffed. The show does not play this entirely for laughs. It sits with Brian's grief for a moment, lets him feel it, lets it be real. And then Stewie, ruthless, precise, surprisingly tender when he needed to be, says exactly the right thing. It is a tiny moment, and the episode moves on quickly, but it established something important about what the Road to episodes could do that regular episodes could not. They could slow down, follow something emotional, and trust that the audience would stay with them. Road to Europe, which aired in the 3rd season, took Stewie to where he most wanted to be. He had been watching a British children's television program called Jolly Farm Review and became utterly devoted to it, convinced that England was his natural spiritual home and that he needed to go there. He stowed away on a plane, Brian followed him, and the plane, as planes in animated comedies tend to do, ended up somewhere completely wrong. They landed in Saudi Arabia. The episode had to navigate some cultural material that has aged with varying degrees of grace. But the core journey, Stewie and Brian working their way across multiple countries, managing each other's personalities, performing an impromptu musical number to steal a camel in a Middle Eastern bazaar, eventually embarrassing the Pope in a hot air balloon over Rome, was genuinely inventive and showed how much creative freedom the Road to format offered. The 3rd installment, Road to Rupert, aired in Season 5 and is perhaps the purest and most satisfying of the early Road to episodes. The premise is exquisitely simple. Brian accidentally sells Rupert Stewie's beloved stuffed teddy bear at a garage sale. He does not realize he has done this until Stewie discovers the bear is gone and is devastated in a way that is both funny and, if you're paying attention, completely sincere. Stewie loves Rupert with the kind of absolute, uncomplicated devotion that only very young children can sustain toward inanimate objects. Rupert is not just a toy. Rupert is a confidant, a comfort, a constant in a world that contains a very large amount of noise and chaos. The search for Rupert takes Brian and Stewie first to the house of the man who bought him at the garage sale, then to Aspen, Colorado, where the man has moved. In Aspen, the episode expands into a ski chase sequence that is both a parody of action movie conventions and a genuinely well-executed piece of physical comedy. They ski, they crash into things, they retrieve Rupert with the focused intensity of people running a heist rather than recovering a toy bear. And through all of it, the episode maintains a clear emotional center. Brian's guilt over what he did, and Stewie's complete forgiveness the moment he has Rupert back in his arms. Road to Germany from Season 7 was the first Road 2 episode, directed by Greg Colton after the previous installments had all been handled by Dan Povenmire, and it marked a tonal shift in the series. It is the darkest of the Road 2 episodes by a significant margin. It begins with a pharmacist named Mort Goldman stumbling into Stewie's time machine. By mistake, he was looking for a bathroom and ending up in Warsaw, Poland, on the 1st of September 1939, the first day of the Nazi invasion of Poland. Stewie and Brian follow him. They are in the middle of the Second World War. The episode navigates this setting with a kind of care that the show did not always apply to heavy subjects. The humor is present, but the stakes feel real. Mort is Jewish, and the episode does not minimize what that means in the context of 1939 Europe. Stewie and Brian have to get him out, which requires obtaining uranium to power the return pad, which requires getting to England. They run from Nazis. They pass themselves off as German officers. Brian, a dog, interacts with a world that would not have treated him kindly if anyone had been paying close enough attention. The episode ends with them back in the present, and Mort alive, and a kind of quiet settling of the emotional temperature that suggested the show knew it had done something different, something that required acknowledgement. Road to the North Pole, from Season 9, was the first Road 2 episode to run to an hour in length, and it is widely considered one of the best Christmas specials in animated television history. The setup is that Stewie, after being dismissed by a tired and irritable mall Santa, decides to travel to the North Pole to kill the real Santa Claus. He recruits Brian, who has approximately no enthusiasm for this plan but goes anyway. What they find at the North Pole is not what either of them expected. Santa Claus, in this episode, is not the jolly red-suited archetype. He is a worn-down man operating a factory that has not been able to keep up with global demand for decades. The workshop is understaffed. The reindeer are suffering. The elves are at the edge of collapse. The magic of Christmas has been eroded by the sheer scale of what it now requires, and Santa is a man in crisis rather than a figure of celebration. The original song the episode builds to, "Christmas Time is Killing Us," is genuinely well-written, a darkly comedic anthem sung by the North Pole workers about how impossible their workload has become, delivered with enough musical craft and emotional sincerity to work both as comedy and as something slightly sadder underneath the comedy. Stewie's plan to kill Santa dissolves when he sees what he actually finds at the North Pole. What replaces it is something more interesting. He and Brian try to help. They attempt to deliver presents themselves, which goes about as well as you would expect given that neither of them has any reindeer, any magic, or any particular experience with home delivery logistics. The sequence of them trying to personally deliver gifts to the children of the world on Christmas Eve is funny in the specific way that ambitious plans executed by unqualified people are funny. There is enthusiasm and there is chaos. And there is a mounting gap between what they wanted to accomplish and what they are actually managing. Road to the Multiverse, which opened Season 8 in September of 2009, is widely regarded as the best of the Road 2 episodes, and in polls of fans it consistently places at or near the top of the list of the best Family Guy episodes ever made. The concept is straightforwardly brilliant. Stewie has built a remote control that can shift them between alternate parallel universes. Each time they press a button, they land in a new version of reality. Some are slight variations on the world they know. Some are radically different. They visit a universe where Christianity never developed, and humanity is accordingly 1,000 years more technologically advanced. They visit a universe styled like a Flintstones episode, where everything is made of stone and prehistoric animals perform household appliance functions. They visit a Japan-dominated universe, an aftermath of an alternate World War II outcome. They visit a universe drawn in the style of a Disney animated musical, complete with bluebirds and spontaneous singing. They visit a live-action universe, where they appear as actual real people and the world around them is filmed rather than animated. They visit a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are the pets, which Brian discovers he is extremely comfortable with. The episode is visually audacious in a way that almost nothing else in the show's history matches. Each universe requires an entirely different animation approach, a different color palette, different character designs, different sonic landscape. The production value is unmistakable. Someone cared about making this episode look extraordinary, and it shows. Road to India, from season 15, sent Brian and Stewie to India after Brian fell in love with a customer service representative named Padma. The episode is looser and more relaxed than some of the stronger installments, but it has its own pleasures. The contrast between Brian's romantic idealization of Padma and the reality of her actual life, the visual comedy of the two of them navigating a world completely outside their experience, and a late episode emotional beat that lands more genuinely than you might expect from a story that began with Brian calling a customer service line. What all of these episodes share, regardless of where they land on the quality spectrum, is the fundamental thing that made the Road to format work: time. They gave Brian and Stewie time. Time to talk to each other, time to navigate something together, time to let the relationship breathe and develop and reveal itself. The regular episodes of Family Guy moved quickly, packed jokes tightly, jumped from idea to idea. The Road to episodes had a different metabolism. They were longer in their scenes. They sat in moments. And it is in that sitting that the best things in the Brian-Stewie dynamic emerged. Section 6. Meg Griffin, More Than the Punchline. Meg Griffin has one of the strangest and most emotionally complicated arcs in animated television history. She is not a tragic character in the classical sense. She is funny, often sharply written, and has moments of real strength scattered throughout the show's run. But the sheer volume and persistence of the cruelty directed at her, over so many seasons, accumulated into something that asked more of the audience than most animated comedies ever do. At some point, watching Meg get mistreated stopped being a joke and started being a question. In Season 1, Meg is voiced by Lacey Chabert, and then from Season 2 onward by Mila Kunis. The original Meg before the show calcified her treatment into something formulaic was a recognizable teenager. Unpopular at school, not conventionally cool, trying to find her place in a family that ran so hot and loud that being the quiet, ordinary one felt like a permanent disadvantage. She wore a pink beanie and had brown hair and wanted, more than almost anything, to be liked, to belong somewhere, to have her father look at her with the straightforward warmth that parents on better-written shows extended to their children without incident. In those early seasons, the treatment she received was mild. Her family did not despise her. Peter was inattentive rather than hostile. The kids at school were unkind in the specific low-key way that teenagers are unkind to whoever they have collectively decided is slightly outside the acceptable perimeter. It was recognizable without being brutal. It had the texture of real adolescent experience, just pushed a degree or two toward comedy. The shift started in Season 4, after the show returned from its cancellation hiatus. The jokes about Meg moved from her being boring or ordinary to her being ugly, which is a significant categorical change. When you joke that someone is uninteresting, you are commenting on a quality that is contingent and changeable. When you joke that someone is physically unattractive, you are commenting on something they cannot control, and the humor acquires a meanness that the original jokes did not have. The show started having characters physically recoil from Meg. They started making sounds of disgust when she entered rooms. Peter began making comments about her appearance that no father should make about his own daughter. By the time the show reached its middle seasons, Meg's mistreatment had become one of its defining features. The physical humor directed at her was constant and escalating. Peter farted in her face as a running joke. He pushed her. He made comments about wishing she did not exist. In one episode, a flashback revealed that Peter and Lois had once attempted to abandon baby Meg at a fire station, leaving her there, walking away, choosing not to take her home. The episode presented this as a joke. The audience was meant to laugh at it. The most complicated and most discussed episode in the entire Meg storyline is Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10. In this episode, the Griffin family is trapped inside during a hurricane. Meg, having reached some internal breaking point, confronts them. She tells Peter what he has done to her. She tells Lois what she has failed to provide. She is specific, accurate, and completely correct about everything she says. It is an extraordinary scene. Meg, who has absorbed an enormous amount of cruelty quietly and for a very long time, finally saying clearly and plainly what the cost of that cruelty has been. For a moment it seems like the show is going to do something with this. The family falls apart without Meg to serve as their collective pressure valve. They turn on each other. The harmony that Meg's presence provides, by absorbing the family's displaced aggression, disappears, and the results are immediate and unpleasant. And then Meg makes a choice. She goes back. She takes back her confrontation. She returns to the position of accepting the family's behavior because the alternative, the family being forced to face itself, would be worse. The episode was widely criticized not for its quality, which is actually quite high, but for its conclusion. What it says, and what it says clearly and without apparent irony, is that someone who absorbs abuse should continue to absorb it because their suffering has a function. That function is to keep everyone else stable. Meg's pain has a purpose. The purpose is to spare the rest of the family the work of dealing with their own problems. And she accepts this role, willingly, because the show needs her to in order to reset to its normal operating mode. Whether the writers were aware of what they were saying is genuinely unclear. The episode is smart enough in its construction that it feels intentional. But the show's failure to build on what that episode established, the almost immediate return to the same dynamics in the following episodes, suggests that the intention, if it existed, went no further than that single hour of television. There are episodes scattered throughout the show's run that treat Meg as a full character rather than a target, and they tend to be among the more memorable episodes she appears in. In the crossover episode with The Simpsons, Meg meets Lisa Simpson, who recognizes in Meg someone similar to herself, someone who is more capable than her family gives her credit for, someone whose intelligence and sensitivity are real qualities rather than disadvantages to be mocked. Lisa helps Meg discover that she has a talent for playing saxophone. She encourages her, and Meg, in that episode, does something she does not get to do often enough. She thrives. In the episode Peter's Sister, the show actually makes a genuine attempt to explain Peter's behavior toward Meg. It is revealed that Peter's own sister had been physically and emotionally abusive to him when they were children. The cycle of abuse is presented explicitly. Peter was mistreated, and the pattern propagated itself forward into his relationship with his own daughter. Meg learns about this. She chooses compassion. She and Peter have a reconciliation that is quiet and real and carries actual weight. It is one of the most adult moments in the entire show's history. And then the next episode operates as though none of it happened. That is the fundamental Meg problem. The show knows how to write her well. It knows what she is capable of as a character. It knows what her story could be. And it returns, again and again, to the easier version of the story, the one where she is simply the target, because that story requires less of the writers and less of the show. Meg deserved better. The character, the writing, the voice performance that Mila Kunis brought to her even in episodes that gave her nothing to work with, all of it deserved better. And in the later seasons, as more women joined the writing staff and pushed back against the worst of it, Meg began, gradually, to get it. By the show's more recent seasons, she fights back. She wins. She is competent and occasionally terrifying, and no longer simply absorbs whatever the world decides to give her. It is a late arrival at a destination she should have reached much sooner, but it is real, and it changes the character into something worth watching. Section 7. Ernie the Giant Chicken, the most personal feud in television history. There is a man named Peter Griffin. There is a chicken named Ernie. Between them, over the course of more than 2 decades, there have been fights that have destroyed buildings, overturned trains, brought down helicopters, traversed time itself, and cost the lives of an uncounted number of bystanders who simply had the misfortune of being in the vicinity when the two of them spotted each other. The cause of all this? An expired coupon. The feud began in the Season 1 episode Da Boom, though the origin story was not fully revealed until later. In a flashback that the show eventually delivered, Ernie the Giant Chicken once gave Peter a coupon. Peter tried to use the coupon. The coupon was expired. Ernie refused to honor it. And from that moment, the two of them have been locked in a conflict of escalating absurdity that the show has periodically revisited for over 2 decades, each time trying to outscale the previous encounter. The first actual on-screen chicken fight appears in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, and it establishes the template that every subsequent fight would follow. Peter and Ernie see each other. They size each other up for a moment, and then they begin fighting, and they do not stop for a very long time. The fight moves through locations out of the immediate setting, through buildings, across streets, into traffic, through structures that should not be survivable, and the joke is threefold. First, it is the sheer length and escalation of the conflict, which dwarfs any reasonable response to any conceivable provocation. Second, it is the film grammar. The show uses slow-motion shots, dramatic music, choreography borrowed from action movie conventions applied to what is ultimately a dispute about grocery store savings. Third, it is the way the episode continues after the fight, as though the fight did not happen, with Peter returning to whatever he was doing before, battered and bloody, and everyone around him treating this as completely normal. Peter always wins. This is a rule as fixed as anything in the show's internal logic. Ernie always survives. This is equally fixed. The ending of every chicken fight is the same in its structure. Peter appears to have definitively finished things, walks away, and the camera finds Ernie lying somewhere improbable, then shows one eye opening. Ernie is not dead. Ernie is never dead. The next fight is already being prepared somewhere in the script of an episode not yet written. The second major chicken fight, from the Season 4 episode Blind Ambition, is considered by many fans to be the best of the series. The scale is larger than the first. The action movie references are more specific. There is a direct homage to Indiana Jones at one point, including a sequence that mirrors the famous fight over the airplane in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Ernie has a wife in this episode. Her name is Nicole. She is also a giant chicken. In the middle of the fight, there is an interlude in which Ernie and Nicole take Peter out to dinner. They sit at a restaurant, they eat. There is a moment of apparent civility, a suggestion that perhaps these two people can coexist in the world without destroying everything around them. And then the check arrives, and Peter and Ernie disagree about who should pay, and the fighting resumes. This moment, the dinner interlude, is one of the most perfectly constructed jokes in the show's history. It earns its place by appearing genuinely unexpected, by maintaining the absurdity of the broader situation while introducing a new layer of absurdity that somehow makes the whole thing more coherent rather than less. Of course they went to dinner. Of course the check destroyed the peace. Of course the Ferris wheel was involved in what followed. The third major fight came in a later season and introduced a new level of property damage and personal injury that made the first two fights look restrained by comparison. The fourth fight was different again, bigger again, more cinematic again. Each fight had its own references, its own set pieces, its own particular flavor of chaos. By the time of the internal affairs fight, which took place during a later season, Peter and Ernie ended up on Stewie's time pad and fought their way through multiple historical periods, eventually ending up in space and on an oil rig that they destroyed between them, with Ernie being hanged, pierced, and ultimately roasted by rocket engines before somehow surviving all of it. Ernie the Giant Chicken was confirmed as officially dead in a later episode called The Chicken or the Meg, in which Meg Griffin is involved in his final fate. The producers made the decision to retire the character, concluding that he had run his course. It was a decision that marked the end of one of the show's longest and most beloved running bits. Whether the ending was earned, whether the retirement felt right, whether the final episode gave the character the send-off the decades of history deserved, these are questions that Family Guy fans have opinions about. But the existence of those opinions is itself testimony to how much the chicken fights mattered. You do not argue about the end of a running gag unless the running gag meant something to you. There is an underlying philosophy to the chicken fights that the show never quite articulated but always operated from. The fights are not really about the coupon. The coupon was just the ignition point. What the fights are actually about is the strange human capacity to sustain a conflict long past the moment when the original grievance has any meaningful weight. Peter and Ernie have destroyed city blocks, caused mass casualties among innocent bystanders, fought through time and space, and yet neither of them has ever, in any fight, stopped and asked whether the coupon was worth it. They have committed. The commitment is total. And in that total commitment to something so fundamentally disproportionate to its cause, the show captures something almost philosophical about pride and stubbornness, and the way people can sustain enmity, not because they need to, but simply because the enmity has become, over time, part of their identity. Section 8. Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland. The Drunken Clam Crew. The group that gathers at the Drunken Clam Bar on Spooner Street is one of the most effective ensemble configurations in animated comedy. Peter Griffin, Glenn Quagmire, Joe Swanson, and Cleveland Brown, four men of profoundly different personalities, profoundly different life circumstances, and profoundly different moral compasses, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same drinks, and somehow constituting a genuine friendship that has weathered decades of completely impractical situations. Glenn Quagmire is, on the surface, a straightforward character. He is an airline pilot. He has an extremely consistent aesthetic square jaw, prominent chin, swept-back hair that has not changed in 40 years, a wardrobe that includes a significant number of bowling shirts. He has a catchphrase that entered the cultural vocabulary almost immediately after the show's early seasons aired. He is, by any objective measure, a man of extravagant and largely unreflective appetites. But Quagmire, when the show took him seriously, turned out to be considerably more complicated than his surface suggested. He had a backstory that the show revealed gradually, and the pieces of it, when assembled, produced a more sympathetic picture than the jokes about him typically implied. He served in the Navy. He has a genuine sense of loyalty to his friends that the show demonstrated repeatedly. When something actually mattered, when a friend needed help in a way that required real commitment rather than just showing up at a bar, Quagmire was reliable. The episode Quagmire's Dad from Season 8 is the most revealing exploration of his character that the show ever offered. It establishes that Quagmire had a father, a Navy veteran named Dan Quagmire, and that a significant portion of Quagmire's personality, including his difficulty with sustained commitment and the defensive cheerfulness he deploys around other people, has roots in his relationship with that father. The episode handles its subject matter, specifically the revelation that Dan Quagmire has transitioned and is now a woman named Ida, with more care than the show typically brought to sensitive subjects. The resolution is not perfect, and some of the jokes in the episode have aged poorly, but the emotional arc is genuine. His relationship with Brian is one of the most consistent recurring dynamics in the show's later seasons. Quagmire dislikes Brian. He has always disliked Brian. The reasons he gives in the famous speech from Jerome is the new black, the hypocrisy, the pretension, the way Brian presents himself as morally superior while behaving in ways that are frequently worse than the people he criticizes are accurate. Quagmire is not wrong. And yet the dynamic between them is more interesting than simple antagonism, because Quagmire himself is not a paragon of virtue. He knows this. He has never claimed otherwise. What he cannot tolerate is someone who does claim it while failing to live up to it. Joe Swanson arrived in Quahog in the first season episode A Hero Sits Next Door and immediately established himself as the most impressive person on Spooner Street. He moved in. He was in a wheelchair. And within approximately 12 minutes of arriving, he had solved a hostage situation, won a neighborhood baseball game despite being unable to run the bases, and become the person everyone on the street wanted to spend time with. Peter was jealous of him immediately, which is one of the more endearing things about early Peter. He could recognize genuine excellence in other people and feel the appropriate emotion about it. Joe's backstory is, like most Family Guy backstories, inconsistent in its details. The original story, established in his debut episode, was that Joe was injured on Christmas Eve while investigating a robbery at an orphanage. He confronted a criminal who was dressed as the Grinch, and during a rooftop chase while wearing ice skates, he slid off the roof and injured his spine. This is an extraordinary origin story by any measure. Later, in Season 11, the show revealed that this was actually a cover story. The truth was that Joe was shot in both legs while working undercover in a heroin lab, and the criminal who shot him was a man named Bobby Briggs. The orphanage story had been the version that was easier to tell at parties. Joe's defining characteristic across the show's run is the way physical limitation intersects with an essentially unbreakable will. He is, from the waist down, unable to move without the wheelchair. He is, from the waist up, capable of physical feats that people without his injury would struggle to match. He has beaten opponents in hand-to-hand combat while seated. He has chased criminals across terrain that would challenge someone on foot. In one episode, during a post-apocalyptic scenario in Daboom, where his lower body has literally melted into his driveway, he fights and defeats a giant mutated rat. The specificity of that image, Joe Swanson, unable to move, defeating a giant mutated rat with his fists while his legs are fused to the pavement, is a perfect distillation of what the show found funny about him. His marriage to Bonnie Swanson was one of the show's more honest, ongoing domestic storylines. Bonnie was, for many early seasons, pregnant an extended pregnancy that seemed to last approximately 4 years of real time, which became its own running joke before the character was finally born. Bonnie and Joe's relationship went through significant strain in the show's middle seasons. The marriage was difficult. Joe's emotional unavailability, his tendency to channel everything through work and through the performance of toughness, made real intimacy hard. There were episodes where Bonnie considered leaving. There were episodes where the two of them hit moments of genuine crisis. The show rarely resolved these moments cleanly, preferring instead to leave the Swanson marriage in an ongoing state of complicated stability that felt, in its messiness, truer than many animated marriages. Cleveland Brown, the fourth member of the group, was the gentlest of them. His voice was low and warm and slightly measured, and he had a particular quality of taking a moment before responding to things that made him seem, in comparison to the other three, enormously wise. He was not immune to bad decisions. No one who spends significant time with Peter Griffin is immune to bad decisions, but his bad decisions tended to be gentler. He fell sideways into things rather than charging at them head first. He reacted to chaos with a kind of bemused acceptance rather than the enthusiasm that Peter and Quagmire brought to the same chaos. Cleveland left for his own show, The Cleveland Show, in 2009, and returned to Family Guy after that show ended. His departure changed the dynamic at the Drunken Clam in ways the show acknowledged but never quite fully replaced. The chemistry between the four of them was specific. Cleveland's particular energy in the group, the steady, unhurried counterpoint to Peter's manic energy, and Quagmire's relentless forward motion left a gap when he was gone. When he returned, the show slid him back into position smoothly enough that the gap closed, but there was a period where the Drunken Clam scenes felt like a three-legged table that everyone was pretending was stable. The friendships between these four men, their bar nights, their road trips, their shared disasters, the way they showed up for each other even in the episodes where they were actively causing each other's problems were one of the things the show did most consistently well. Male friendship in television comedy tends to be either portrayed as juvenile competition or as an uncomplicated background element. The Drunken Clam group was neither. They fought. They were selfish with each other sometimes. They gave terrible advice. But they also, consistently and without making a big deal of it, were there. And in the moments when something real happened, when Joe was in genuine pain, when Cleveland was genuinely lost, when Quagmire was honest about something that hurt the others, were present for it. Section 9. The emotional episodes, when Family Guy made you feel something. Family Guy has a reputation as a show that prioritizes shock and absurdity over emotional depth, and the reputation is earned in the sense that a significant portion of its runtime supports it. But there is another Family Guy one that exists in episodes scattered throughout the show's entire run that is genuinely affecting. These episodes do not arrive on a schedule. They do not announce themselves in advance. They appear between regular episodes and do something that regular episodes do not attempt. They make you care about what happens. The Season 3 episode Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows is one of the earliest examples of the show operating at this frequency. Brian is sentenced to community service after a DUI and ends up assigned to a woman named Pearl, an elderly shut-in who has closed herself off entirely from the world after a personal loss decades earlier. Pearl is bitter and hostile, and the episode could easily have played her that way as someone Brian had to neutralize with charm in order to get through his service hours. Instead, the episode treats Pearl with complete seriousness. Her bitterness is not a character flaw. It is the result of something real that happened to her. She loved someone. She lost them. She decided that the only way to protect herself from experiencing that loss again was to experience nothing at all. Brian, who understands something about the desire to protect yourself from the things that can hurt you, sits with her in a way that nobody around her has sat with her in a very long time. He does not try to fix her. He does not perform therapeutic wisdom. He simply keeps coming back. And Pearl, slowly, opens slightly, not fully, not dramatically, but enough. The episode ends with Pearl's death, which arrives quietly rather than as a dramatic event, and with Brian attending her funeral in a way that says something about his character that several seasons of regular episodes could not have communicated as efficiently. The Season 5 episode Peter's Two Dads handled grief with a directness that the show had not attempted before. Peter discovers that his biological father is not Francis Griffin, the Irish Catholic man who raised him, but rather Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish man he had never met. The investigation of his parentage leads Peter to Ireland, and to a confrontation with questions about identity and belonging that the show played, at least in part, as genuinely earnest. The episode also dealt with the death of Francis Griffin, Peter's adoptive father, a complicated man who expressed love through criticism and who never quite managed to say the things that needed saying, and the grief Peter experienced was real enough to slow the episode down and let it breathe. Then there is Brian and Stewie, from Season 8. We have already discussed it at length, but it deserves another moment here because it belongs in any accounting of Family Guy's emotional accomplishments. An episode with no cutaways, no musical numbers, no other characters, no jokes inserted to diffuse the tension of a difficult moment, just two characters in a room having a long, honest conversation about what their lives mean and what they mean to each other. Brian tells Stewie he has thought about ending his life. Stewie responds. The episode does not resolve this with a cheerful callback or a reset. It resolves it by making it clear that Brian, in this specific moment, does not have to be alone with it. That is enough. That is actually, quietly, everything. Road to the North Pole is an emotional episode dressed in the clothes of a holiday adventure. Underneath the dark comedy about Santa's burnout and the escalating catastrophe of Brian and Stewie's delivery attempts, there is something genuinely melancholy about the distance between what Christmas represents and what it actually costs. The episode does not shy away from this. The song Christmas Time is Killing Us is funny, yes, but it is also a song sung by workers who are exhausted past their limits, and the melody and the lyrics together communicate that exhaustion with enough precision that it transcends comedy. The episode Life of Brian, from Season 12, was intended to function as an emotional episode and was, in the immediate moment, experienced as one by a significant portion of the audience. Brian is hit by a car while playing with Stewie in the street. The death is sudden and realistic, no exaggeration, no cartoon elasticity, just a car and then Brian lying in the road, and then the family around him, and then nothing. The Griffin family mourned him genuinely. Stewie was devastated in a way that the show committed to fully, without deflection. The introduction of a new dog, Vinny, was handled with enough character writing that Vinny became, briefly, someone the audience was willing to invest in. And then Brian came back. The reversal was almost universally read as a betrayal of the episode's intentions. But the emotional experience of Life of Brian in isolation, the death itself, the grief, the first weeks without Brian, that experience was real, whatever the show ultimately chose to do with it. The episode succeeded at what it was attempting. The show's decision not to honor that success with permanent consequences is a separate conversation about the show's relationship with its own continuity. Peter's sister, from Season 14, gave Peter and Meg the reconciliation they had been building toward for years. The episode established that Peter was a victim before he became a perpetrator, that the cycle of cruelty he participated in with Meg had its origins in something done to him, and it used this not as an excuse but as a context. Meg's choice, upon learning this, was compassion. She could have used the information as ammunition. She used it instead as a bridge. The reconciliation between them in that episode was the most emotionally complete moment their relationship produced across the entire show's run. It lasted one episode before the reset button was applied, which remains one of the show's more painful self-defeats. But within the confines of that episode, it was real, and it was exactly what Meg's story deserved. Section 10. Peter's Obsessions, Feuds, and Fixations. Beyond the narrative episodes, beyond the storylines with clear arcs and resolutions, Family Guy accumulated over the years an enormous number of running fixations that Peter held with the unshakable conviction of a man who had found a passion and saw no reason to moderate it. These obsessions were not always explained and never needed to be. They arrived fully formed and in many cases persisted for seasons before being retired or referenced only obliquely. The Conway Twitty gag is the most famous of these, and it requires some context to fully appreciate. Conway Twitty was a real person, a country music artist who lived from 1933 to 1993 and recorded an enormous catalog of hits over a career that spanned several decades. His music was polished, romantic, and extremely sincere in the register of classic American country. He was, by any measure, a serious artist with a devoted audience. He had absolutely nothing to do with Family Guy, which is precisely the point. The gag began in March 2007, in an episode where Peter, finding himself in an awkward situation with Lois, needed a distraction. He broke the fourth wall and announced, addressing the audience directly, that he would like to introduce the ladies and gentlemen to Mr. Conway Twitty. The camera then cut to actual archival footage of Conway Twitty performing one of his songs in full, not a clip. A full performance. Several minutes of Conway Twitty singing, with the Family Guy plot entirely suspended before the episode resumed. The first time this happened, the joke was the surprise. The audience had no framework for it. There was no setup. There was no punchline in the conventional sense. The punchline was the thing that replaced the punchline. By the second time, it happened in a later episode called Peter's Daughter, where Peter used the Conway Twitty performance to avoid telling Meg he loved her. The joke had deepened. Now there was context. Now the audience knew what it meant when Peter reached for Conway Twitty. It meant Peter was avoiding something. It meant he was using Twitty as a shield against a moment of vulnerability or honesty that he was not prepared to face. The performance that followed the full song, Hello Darlin', playing over the credits, was both funny and, if you were paying attention to what it was covering, slightly heartbreaking. The gag returned enough times that it became genuinely controversial in some corners of the fan community. The episode The Juice is Loose featured a full 3-minute performance, which many viewers felt was too much, that the commitment to the bit had crossed from dedication into something that felt like the show filling time. Ultimately, the show itself seemed to recognize that the gag had run its course. In a later episode, God told Peter to stop doing it, and the gag was largely retired afterward. Peter's other obsessions were more varied in their character. He had at various points developed intense attachments to specific television shows, to specific foods, to specific pieces of music, to specific experiences that he could not let go of even when the moment had clearly passed. He went through a phase of dancing during inappropriate moments. He became briefly convinced that he was a good athlete and pursued this conviction until circumstances made it unmaintainable. He developed opinions about matters of taste, film criticism, architectural design, the quality of local restaurants that had no foundation in actual knowledge, but were expressed with complete authority. His fixation on the past is one of his most consistent qualities. Peter loved the 1970s and 1980s in the way that people loved decades that represented their childhoods, not because those decades were objectively superior to the present, but because they were the era in which everything felt new and possible and real in the specific way that things feel before you become entirely jaded. He referenced movies, television shows, and cultural artifacts of those eras constantly and with deep affection. His knowledge of popular culture from those decades was encyclopedic in a way that his knowledge of almost everything else was not. The recurring bit where Peter would watch something or hear about something and announce that he could not sit through something that insists upon itself is one of the more revealing jokes the show wrote about him. The movie he most famously criticized in this way was The Godfather, which is a film that a significant portion of the audience would defend as one of the greatest movies ever made. Peter's criticism is not that The Godfather is bad. His criticism is that it takes itself seriously, that it believes in its own importance, and that this belief is itself a kind of pretension that he finds off-putting. Whether or not you agree with this reading of The Godfather, the joke captures something true about Peter, that he was suspicious of seriousness, that he found earnestness in art uncomfortable in the way that people find earnestness uncomfortable when they are protecting themselves from caring too much. His ongoing relationship with his neighbor Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, the billionaire who never stopped disapproving of Peter, was another form of fixation. Peter wanted Carter's approval. He never got it in any clean, uncomplicated way. Carter found Peter ridiculous, which Peter both knew and found infuriating, and the two of them circled each other across decades of Thanksgiving dinners and family events and occasional business interactions, always at exactly the distance from each other that their relationship required. The fixation on Quagmire's sex life was a running joke that varied enormously in quality from episode to episode, but had a consistent underlying logic. Quagmire's lifestyle, presented without judgment in the early seasons, became more and more of a reference point as the show developed. Quagmire himself seemed to live in a parallel moral universe, where his behavior was simply his behavior, not defended, not apologized for, simply existing. This was both the joke and the character's fundamental truth. Section 11. The most surreal storylines. When Family Guy got genuinely strange, Family Guy has always operated at a certain baseline level of absurdity. A talking dog, an evil genius infant, a man whose best friend is a giant chicken who wants to kill him. These are not the premises of a show that is trying to stay tethered to realistic narrative. But within that baseline absurdity, the show occasionally found gears that went well beyond its usual register, producing episodes and storylines so genuinely strange that they felt like a different kind of television entirely. Road to the Multiverse has already been discussed, but it belongs here too, because it is the most thorough example of the show going somewhere its format did not require it to go and doing it with real creative ambition. The episode was not content to imagine one alternate universe. It imagined dozens, and it rendered each one with a visual specificity that required genuinely different production approaches for each universe. The Disney universe was animated in a completely different style, with rounded shapes and bright colors, and spontaneous song in the classic animated musical tradition. The live-action universe placed the characters in the physical world, with actors instead of animation. The Robot Chicken universe used stop-motion animation. Each choice was a commitment, and every commitment cost time and resources, and required the production staff to solve problems they had not solved before. The Back to the Pilot episode, from Season 10, is another example of the show using its own mythology in strange and interesting ways. Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the very first episode of Family Guy, to Death Has a Shadow, the pilot, and find themselves on the animated set of the show's own past. They watch the original versions of the characters going about the original storyline, they interact with the environment, and then Brian, with the logic of someone who has had one too many drinks and some strong opinions about George W. Bush, begins trying to change the timeline in ways that have cascading consequences. The episode eventually multiplies into a situation involving an enormous number of Brians and Stewies from different points in time, all of them trying to manage the consequences of the alterations, and it reaches a kind of comic density that the show rarely attempted. Too many moving parts, too many variables, the narrative becoming genuinely chaotic in a way that felt earned rather than careless. The Stewie Griffin, the Untold Story direct-to-DVD movie, released in 2005, is one of the more ambitious pieces of content the show has ever produced. It told a story in 3 segments that spanned a significant stretch of time and imagined multiple versions of Stewie's life. The first segment involved Stewie believing he was about to die and reassessing his priorities. The second involved a road trip. The third, Stu and Stewie's excellent adventure, was the most interesting. Adult Stewie, at 35 years old, uses a wristwatch time machine to visit his past self, and the two of them interact across a gap of decades. The adult Stewie, it turns out, is not what the baby Stewie imagined he would become. He is ordinary. He is living a life that the evil genius baby of Season 1 would have found deeply disappointing. The meeting between the two versions of the character, the ambition of the baby, and the reality of the adult was genuinely poignant, and suggested a direction for the character that the show ultimately took in a different form. The episode Yugilamuf reversed time in the most literal possible way. Brian, having used Stewie's time machine without permission to improve his dating life, accidentally damages the chronological gauge on the machine. His attempt to repair it has the opposite of the intended effect. It reverses the flow of time for everyone in the world, not just for him and Stewie. Time begins running backward. People uneat food. Broken objects reassemble themselves. Conversations run in reverse. Eventually, if not corrected, time will run backward far enough that Stewie will unexist. He will cease to have been born. The episode uses this premise to explore, in a genuinely strange structural way, what time reversal would actually look like and feel like for the characters experiencing it. Brian has to navigate events that are happening backward. The comedy of this is physical and disorienting in a satisfying way. The emotional stakes are real enough that the resolution, when it comes, carries actual weight, rather than simply being a technical fix. The episode And Then There Were Fewer, from Season 9, was a complete genre departure, a murder mystery in the classic Agatha Christie tradition, with a locked estate, a gathering of characters, and a killer moving through them one by one. The show played this largely straight. People actually died in this episode. Not in the cartoon deaths that earlier episodes had treated as reversible, but in actual permanent deaths that changed the show's supporting cast going forward. Tom Tucker's co-anchor Diane Simmons was revealed as the murderer and was killed by James Woods before she could complete her plan. Muriel Goldman, wife of the pharmacist Mort Goldman, also died in this episode. These deaths stuck. And Then There Were Fewer was a season premiere, which meant it had to accomplish the work that season premieres have always had to accomplish. Remind the audience of what this show is, establish the register of the season to come, and signal what kind of territory the writers were interested in exploring. The choice to open with a murder mystery was a signal that the show still had formal ambitions, that it was willing to try things. Its format did not require it to try. The Cutaway Land episode, in which Peter and Lois physically enter the world of the show's own cutaway gags, was a stranger and less successful experiment, but it was an experiment worth acknowledging as an attempt to do something genuinely weird with the show's own signature format. The conceit that the cutaway gags are physical spaces that characters can enter and navigate like rooms has an interesting internal logic that the episode only partially explored. It used recycled cutaways rather than new ones, which deflated some of the potential, and the ending, in which Peter woke up and the whole thing was a dream, was the safest possible resolution to a premise that could have gone somewhere more interesting. The alternate universe episodes and the time travel episodes, taken together, constitute a significant portion of the show's most formally ambitious output. They suggest a show that, at its best, was not satisfied with simply executing its standard formula at a competent level, but was interested in pushing against the edges of what its format allowed. Section 12. Legacy, Lore, and Why This World Has Lasted. There is a question that underlies everything about Family Guy's longevity, and it is not the one that critics have spent 20 years arguing about. The critics argue about quality, whether it's still good, whether it was ever as good as people remember, whether the early seasons genuinely represent some lost golden era, or whether nostalgia is doing the heavy lifting. That argument is real and ongoing and will probably not be resolved. But the more interesting question is about resonance. Why does this specific world, this specific street in a fictional Rhode Island city, these specific characters with their specific voices and their specific ways of moving through situations continue to hold a place in the cultural imagination in a way that so few animated properties manage to sustain for more than a season or two? Part of the answer is the voices. Seth MacFarlane's voice performances are among the most distinctive in the history of animated comedy, and their distinctiveness is not simply a matter of technical vocal ability, though that is there too. What MacFarlane brought to Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire was complete inhabitation. Each character existed in the voice in a way that made the animation feel like documentation of a performance rather than a performance in service of the animation. When you hear Peter's laugh, you know immediately where you are. There is no other laugh like it in animation. When you hear Stewie's precise, slightly theatrical enunciation of something perfectly contemptuous, you recognize it instantaneously. These are not just voices, they are presences. The voice cast beyond MacFarlane contributed equally to the show's texture. Alex Borstein's Lois was warm and exasperated in equal measure, capable of the full register of a woman who had long since made peace with her life, while occasionally being genuinely surprised by it. Seth Green's Chris was gentle and endearingly confused in exactly the right register for the character. Mila Kunis's Meg was, across the show's run, a performance that elevated material it did not always deserve. Patrick Warburton's Joe was, from the beginning, one of the funniest voice performances in the show. The combination of the deep, authoritative voice and the completely unself-conscious enthusiasm with which Joe approached everything he did produced comedy that seemed effortless and required considerable precision. The world itself, the invented geography of the town, also matters more than it might seem. Quahog is a real place in the way that fictional places become real through the accumulation of specific details that give it mass. The Drunken Clam has a particular booth, the Pawtucket Brewery has a particular layout. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street has a particular arrangement of rooms, a particular quality of light, a particular way that the backyard looks when the show pulls back to show it. These details, repeated across hundreds of episodes, produce familiarity. And familiarity is a powerful emotional adhesive. When you return to a world you know well, you are not simply watching, you are visiting. The recurring characters who populate the edges of the Griffin family's world are, collectively, one of the show's great ongoing achievements. Adam West as the mayor of the town playing a surrealist version of himself that had almost nothing to do with the real Adam West and everything to do with the show's particular comedic sensibility contributed a quality of gentle strangeness to the episodes where he appeared. His character would make pronouncements that were delivered with complete conviction and made absolutely no sense. He would pursue fixations that had no logic. He was the embodiment of a certain kind of authoritative absurdity that the show deployed brilliantly, and that West played with obvious affection for the material. Herbert the elderly neighbor, voiced by Mike Henry, was a character whose humor aged with increasing complexity as cultural conversations about the subjects the character addressed changed around him. In his earliest appearances, Herbert was used as a recurring visual joke: the creaking walk, the trembling voice, the dog Jesse, who was in roughly the same physical condition as his owner. The show knew what it was doing with the character and leaned into the discomfort deliberately. In some episodes, Herbert was given unexpected moments of genuine emotion: his wartime history, his isolation, the particular loneliness of a very old person that complicated the pure shock function the character sometimes served. The show's relationship with celebrity cameos evolved over its run in interesting ways. In the early seasons, celebrities who appeared as themselves were treated with a certain ambivalence. The show was not particularly reverent about fame and was willing to make its guest stars the butt of jokes in ways that required some mutual good nature. On the celebrities' part, James Woods, who appeared in multiple episodes and became a recurring character, was perhaps the most sustained celebrity presence. The show developed a version of James Woods that was vain, impulsive, and genuinely dangerous, and who the show treated with enough affection that the running joke never felt mean-spirited, even at its most extreme. The Star Wars specials, Blue Harvest, Something 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 Dark Side, and It's a Trap, representing the show's 3-episode parody of the original Star Wars trilogy, demonstrated the show's capacity for long-form parody work. Each episode took a full film and replicated its structure with the Family Guy characters in the roles: Peter as Han Solo, Lois as Princess Leia, Chris as Luke Skywalker, Herbert as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Stewie as Darth Vader, and built jokes from the specific details of those films while also maintaining the Family Guy sensibility throughout. Blue Harvest, which aired in 2007 and parodied the original 1977 Star Wars film, was the strongest of the three, finding the funniest material in the collision between Family Guy's register and Star Wars' operatic seriousness. The Simpsons crossover episode from season 13 brought together two of the biggest animated franchises in television history and managed to be something more than simply a marketing event. The episode put the Griffin family in Springfield and paired up its characters with their Simpsons counterparts. Homer and Peter became fast friends. Stewie became fascinated with Bart. Lisa tried to mentor Meg. The show used these pairings to make jokes about the similarities between the two shows. Both are animated family comedies, featuring an overweight, good-natured father, a capable wife, a smart kid, a troubled teenager, and a baby with an unusual relationship to the world, while also making jokes about the specific differences in how each show handled those similarities. The central conflict of the episode, a lawsuit over beer brand copyright between Pawtucket Ale and Duff Beer, was a transparent metaphor for the decades of comparison between the two shows, and the show deployed it with enough self-awareness that it was funny rather than defensive. What endures about Family Guy, after everything, is the relationship between the characters that the show established early and never entirely lost track of, even in the episodes that tested it most. Brian and Stewie in a bank vault, reading to each other, keeping each other company through a long, locked night. Peter and Lois making up after a fight that got out of hand, remembering what they chose in each other. Joe Swanson refusing to let his circumstances define what he was capable of. Quagmire, in an unguarded moment, being more honest than his public persona required. Meg, finally, and after too long, fighting back. These are the moments the show was built to produce. Not the chicken fights, not the Conway Twitty performances, not the alternate universes or the time machines or the absurdist tangents that fill so much of its runtime. Those are the decorations. The house underneath them is built from the relationships. A talking dog and an evil baby genius who grew up into something more complicated. A father who was capable of more than he usually showed. A family that, despite everything that was thrown at them and everything they threw at each other, kept showing up at the same dinner table. Quahog is still there. Spooner Street is still there. The Drunken Clam has its usual booth available. The time machine in Stewie's room is charged and ready. The chicken is somewhere in the neighborhood, looking for an excuse. And at number 31, if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear the specific rhythm of that household, loud and chaotic and frequently inappropriate and, underneath all of it, unmistakably home. The show has now been confirmed to run through its 27th season, bringing it to the 2028 to 2029 television season, its 30th anniversary. 30 years of the same street, 30 years of the same voices, 30 years of the Drunken Clam, and the chicken fights, and Brian ordering drinks that cost more than his dignity in any given week. and Stewie contemplating the size of his legacy from a position of comfortable impossibility. It is a strange thing to sustain, and a stranger thing to love, but here we are. That is where we will leave it for tonight. Somewhere on Spooner Street, the lights are off. Everyone has settled in. Peter is probably on the couch. Brian is probably somewhere near a wine glass. Stewie, almost certainly, is doing something that nobody else in the house knows about. Get some rest. The town will still be here when you wake up. If this kind of long, slow, story-based content is something you enjoy, subscribe. It helps more than you probably think it does. Leave a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen to this. I genuinely love knowing where these end up, and we will be back with another one before too long. Take care of yourselves. Good night. Script for Uncle Guy Lore YouTube channel. Fall asleep to crazy Family Guy storylines V3.0. Section 2. Expanded. Peter Griffin's most spectacular disasters. The full account. Let's spend more time with Peter Griffin's disasters, because they deserve it. They are not just funny incidents strung together across 25 seasons. They constitute, when you look at them closely enough, a comprehensive and inadvertent taxonomy of the ways a particular kind of person can move through the world. Not a bad person, not a cruel person in any fundamental sense, even if specific episodes pushed him toward cruelty. A person who operated from a combination of confidence and limitation that produced outcomes no sensible probability assessment could have predicted. The professional storylines are important because work is where most of us reveal ourselves most clearly, since work is the activity that tests the gap between who we believe we are and what we can actually do in a sustained, structured way. Peter's relationship with work was characterized throughout the show's run by a genuine enthusiasm for showing up. He was not lazy in any purposeful sense, combined with an almost complete indifference to the specific requirements of the job, as they were actually described by anyone in authority. He heard instructions and filtered them through his own interpretive framework, which was a framework optimized for outcomes that Peter himself found satisfying, rather than outcomes that the instruction giver had in mind. This produced a consistent pattern in his professional life. Initial employment, a period of relative stability during which the gap between Peter's understanding of his role and the institution's understanding of his role had not yet created consequences, a catalyzing event in which the gap became undeniable, and a resolution that was either an external change to Peter's employment status or a reset that allowed the situation to continue on different terms. The Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory chapter followed this pattern. The Pawtucket Brewery chapter followed it with enough variation to keep the individual incidents interesting, while the underlying structure remained consistent. At the brewery, Peter found colleagues who had, in most cases, worked out a functional accommodation with his particular approach to professional existence. His friend group at the Drunken Clam did not include many of his coworkers, which meant the brewery was a sphere of his life relatively separate from his primary social world. This separation had the effect of making his work episodes feel like excursions into a different environment, a place with its own characters and its own set of rules that Peter negotiated with his usual combination of conviction and inattention. Angela was the key figure in Peter's professional world for most of the show's run. As his supervisor, she occupied the position that supervisors of Peter Griffin occupied. She knew what he was, she had made her peace with what he was, and she managed the situation with the specific resignation of someone who had long since given up the idea that things could be substantially different. She was not warm with Peter. She was not unfair to Peter. She was simply present, dealing with the ongoing situation of Peter's employment with the kind of durable acceptance that some people develop toward chronic conditions they cannot cure. Her death in a later season was one of the show's more affecting supporting character departures, precisely because Angela had been so consistently present for so long. She was not a character who drove storylines or generated strong emotional investment in the conventional sense. She was a character whose consistent presence had become part of the landscape, and whose absence changed the landscape in ways that were felt rather than announced. Peter's relationship with money deserves attention because it was one of the show's most consistent sources of material in the domestic storylines. The Griffin household was not rich. Peter's salary at the brewery, combined with Lois's absence from the paid workforce during most of the show's run, produced a household budget that the show treated as perpetually strained without making poverty itself a primary storyline. The strain expressed itself in specific ways. the things the family could not afford to replace, the vacations that were compromised by financial reality, the decisions Peter made that prioritized short-term pleasure over long-term planning with a consistency that would have alarmed a financial advisor. Peter's get-rich-quick inclinations, the schemes he periodically hatched to address the financial gap between his circumstances and his aspirations, were among the most reliable sources of short-arc comedy. The logic of these schemes was always approximately the same. Peter identified what appeared to be an opportunity, moved on it with complete commitment, encountered an obstacle he had not anticipated, escalated his response to the obstacle in ways that compounded the original problem, and eventually arrived at some version of the status quo ante, with the lesson unlearned and the next scheme already forming somewhere in the background. One of the most remarkable things about Peter Griffin is that he survived all of it. Not metaphorically, but literally. The physical damage Peter accumulated across 25 seasons of adventures would have been fatal many times over to a person operating within normal physiological parameters. He fell from great heights. He was in explosions. He was hit by vehicles. He was involved in structural collapses. He was engaged in sustained physical combat with a giant chicken at intervals across his entire adult life. In every case, the recovery was complete and relatively prompt, and the next episode found him in essentially the same physical condition as the episode before the incident. The show never addressed this directly in any sustained way. It did not build a mythology around Peter's physical indestructibility the way some shows build mythologies around their characters' specific abilities. It simply operated from the baseline assumption that Peter would survive whatever happened to him and would be available for the following episode. This is standard animated comedy practice, but in Peter's case, the gap between what happened to him and what should theoretically have been survivable was wide enough that the show's silence on the subject felt like a running joke rather than an oversight. His relationship with the television set the specific way he watched television. What he watched, how he responded to it, was one of the most quietly revealing aspects of his characterization. Peter watched television with engagement, not with passivity. He reacted to what he saw. He argued with characters on screen. He developed strong opinions about shows and their qualities. He treated the television not as furniture but as a relationship, and the relationship had history and expectations and specific pleasures that he returned to reliably. This engagement with popular culture was one of the sources of the show's most successful running jokes. Peter's opinions about specific films, his preferences among television shows, his ability to place cultural artifacts within a framework of personal significance that had very little relationship to any critical consensus, but was entirely consistent within itself. His dislike of The Godfather for insisting upon itself was the most famous of these, but the sensibility behind it, the suspicion of seriousness, the preference for things that did not ask too much of the viewer, the genuine pleasure in entertainment that delivered what it promised without complication, ran through his relationship with culture consistently. Peter's relationship with Quahog itself, the town as an entity, the civic structures and local institutions that shaped daily life in the Griffin household's immediate environment, was expressed primarily through his relationship with the town's authority figures. The mayor, Adam West, was a man whose specific brand of authority Peter found simultaneously irritating and, in a way he would not have articulated, comforting. The police department, represented most directly by Joe Swanson, had a complex relationship with Peter that the show never fully systematized. Joe was Peter's friend, but Joe was also a law enforcement officer, and Peter's relationship with the law was consistently informal in ways that should theoretically have produced more professional complications for Joe than the show typically allowed. The fire department, the local hospital, the town council, the various commercial establishments that the Griffins patronized, each of these institutions appeared at intervals in the show, and each had its relationship with Peter calibrated to the specific demands of whatever storyline required it. The show was not trying to build a coherent civic picture of Quahog in the way that some shows build detailed institutional worlds. It was building a backdrop that felt real enough to be convincing as context without being detailed enough to constrain what the story needed to do in any given episode. Section 3 expanded Stewie's schemes, the detailed record. The evil plots of Stewie Griffin's early seasons were not interchangeable. This is worth emphasizing because the shorthand description of evil genius baby plotting world domination suggests a repetitive structure, the same plan, the same obstacles, the same outcome that the actual episodes did not exhibit. Each scheme was specific. Each had its own internal logic, its own resource requirements, its own approach to the obstacles it would need to overcome. Stewie was not running the same plan over and over. He was iterating. He was learning from each failure and refining his approach for the next attempt. His scientific work existed within its own coherent framework, though that framework had rules that differed from the rules of physics as currently understood. He built things that worked. The mind control helmet, when deployed, actually controlled minds. The shrink ray actually shrank things. The time machine actually moved through time. These were not toys or simulations. They were functional devices built by someone who had, through means the show never fully explained, developed an engineering capability that should not have been available to a 1-year-old. The question of where Stewie acquired his knowledge is one that the show gestured toward without ever answering directly. The most interesting implication in the early seasons was that the knowledge was innate, that Stewie had arrived in the world already containing, in some form, the understanding he needed, and that his first year of life had been the process of organizing and accessing that understanding. This would explain why the other Griffins, who were exposed to the same educational environment that Stewie was, had not developed comparable capabilities. It was not the environment, it was the specific person encountering it. Stewie's relationship with weapons deserves specific attention because the category of weapons he worked with was notably broad. Conventional firearms appeared regularly and were handled with a competence that the show established early and maintained consistently. Stewie knew how guns worked, he knew how to aim them, and his physical limitations were not limitations on his accuracy. But conventional firearms were really the lowest tier of his arsenal. What interested him, scientifically, were the devices that existed outside conventional armament categories. The ray guns, the temporal weapons, the things that operated on principles of physics that the current universe had not yet developed the vocabulary to describe accurately. His time machine's evolution across the show's run is itself a story worth telling in detail. The original prototype, built in Season 1 to avoid teething, was destroyed by Peter in the same episode, tripped over, reduced to components. The plan it was built for rendered moot. The more developed version that appeared in subsequent seasons had the design that became iconic, a walk-in device roughly the size of a phone booth, capable of depositing its passengers at any point in temporal history with enough accuracy to be operationally useful. A return pad, a smaller device for getting back, accompanied it. The separation of the time machine from the return pad was a narrative convenience that the show used repeatedly to generate the conditions for extended adventure, since it required Brian and Stewie to find their way back home through means other than simply pressing a button. The time machine's destruction in the Life of Brian episode was the show's most structurally significant deployment of the device. Stewie destroyed it. He had decided, in the episode's pre-Brian death storyline, that the machine was causing more problems than it was solving, and he eliminated it. This meant that when Brian was hit by the car later in the same episode, Stewie had no way to go back and prevent it. The machine that had been the solution to every problem of this type was gone. The grief that followed was therefore complete in a way it could not have been if the machine had simply been available and Stewie had chosen not to use it. The Christmas Guy solution, Stewie discovering that his past self had the return pad, borrowing it, going back, was the kind of time travel paradox resolution that science fiction writers call a bootstrap paradox. The object or information that solves the problem comes from a version of the future that would not have existed without the solution. It was logically coherent within the show's established time travel rules. It was also the most emotionally satisfying outcome the episode could have produced, because it was Stewie solving the problem not through new capability, but through intelligence and desperation, through noticing an opportunity that would only exist if you were paying close attention at exactly the right moment. The Bertram rivalry's time travel dimensions were the most elaborate application of temporal mechanics the show produced. The fundamental problem Bertram created was this: Stewie's existence depended on a chain of historical events that included the survival of a specific ancestor, and Bertram had identified this chain and was taking steps to interrupt it. Stewie's counteraction required him to travel through time to protect historical events that he would not have chosen to protect absent the threat events that had, in some cases, significant moral weight that made their protection complicated. The show handled the moral complications with more honesty than it handled many of its other moral complications, acknowledging that Stewie was making choices with real consequences for real historical people in service of his own continued existence. Stewie's relationship with his own future self, as depicted in the Stu and Stewie's excellent adventure segment, was one of the most melancholy pieces of content the show produced. The future Stewie at 35, using the wristwatch time machine to take vacations, was recognizable as a version of the character, but was missing the qualities that had made the one-year-old Stewie extraordinary. He was ordinary. He had done ordinary things. He had become a person rather than a force. The meeting between the two versions was structured as a comedy but landed as something closer to a meditation on what ambition costs when time does not cooperate with it. Section 4. Expanded. Brian Griffin, the dog's complicated legacy. Brian Griffin's career as a writer, the thing that defined his self-image more than any other single element, deserves extended attention because it is one of the show's most honest, ongoing observations about creative ambition and its relationship to reality. The novel existed. It was referenced across multiple seasons as a work in progress. Brian talked about it, defended it, positioned it within conversations about his identity as the evidence that he was a serious person with serious intellectual pursuits. The novel was the thing that separated him from the comedy dog he might otherwise have been. It was the marker of depth, of genuine creative investment, of a life lived in relationship to ideas as well as to the immediate satisfactions of martinis and Lois Griffin. The novel was also, by all accounts the show ever provided, not very good. Brian's friends knew this. Brian, at some level, knew this. The show never delivered the verdict in a mean-spirited way. It was not setting Brian up to be humiliated by his failure as a writer. It was noting, with the specific accuracy of observation that the best comedy achieves, that the gap between believing yourself to be a writer and being one is wide and not always narrowed by the effort involved. Brian believed in himself as a writer. He had not yet written something that justified that belief. This is a condition recognizable to an enormous number of people, and the show treated it with a mixture of sympathy and honesty that served the character well. When Brian finally achieved commercial success with the self-help book Wish It, Want It, Do It, the show used the success to reveal something about the character that had always been present, but not yet fully visible. The difference between wanting to be recognized and being able to handle recognition when it came. Brian wanted success. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted the validation that commercial accomplishment represented. What he did not have, and what the episode demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity, was the capacity to receive that success gracefully. He became monstrous. He treated the person who had believed in him before anyone else did, Stewie, with contempt. He allowed the acknowledgement of his qualities to produce a version of those qualities that was worse than their unacknowledged original. This is a familiar psychological pattern. The person who has spent years feeling undervalued, who, when finally valued, expresses their relief as superiority, and the show captured it with a specificity that went beyond what a purely comedic treatment would have required. It was interested in the psychology, not just the comedy of it. Brian's dating life was one of the show's most consistent sources of both comedy and pathos in the early seasons. The show was honest about Brian's patterns. He fell for women who were fundamentally unavailable to him in one way or another. He idealized them past the point that any real person could sustain, and he was repeatedly surprised when the gap between the idealized version and the real person produced disappointment. This was not a flaw of stupidity. It was a flaw of feeling the excessive hopefulness that some people carry into romantic situations, regardless of the evidence that has accumulated against it. His feelings for Lois were the cleanest expression of this pattern. She was the woman he could not have, which made her perfect for the role his emotional architecture had assigned her. She was competent and warm and capable in ways that Brian valued, and she chose Peter, which placed her permanently in the category of things Brian wanted and could not reach. The show maintained this dynamic in the early seasons with enough restraint that it never became uncomfortable. Brian's feelings were present but not intrusive, affecting without being expressed in ways that damaged the friendship or the household. They were simply part of who he was, a background condition that shaped his character without defining it. The Road to Rhode Island episode's discovery of Brian's mother's fate was the most direct the show ever got about the specific loss that shaped Brian's character. A dog who was abandoned, who was given up by his original family, who found a new home in circumstances that placed him in a complicated position of being both a pet and a family member, and who then traveled to find his biological mother and discovered she was gone before he could say anything to her. The grief of that was real, and the show let it be real, and Stewie's presence with Brian in that grief was the moment their friendship became something more than convenience or mutual interest. It became care. Section 5. Expanded. The complete Road to record. The complete list of Road to episodes, with their individual qualities, reveals a creative strand that the show returned to with more consistency and more ambition than any other recurring format. The installments, in order of production, were Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, Roads to Vegas, Road to India, and various subsequent installments in later seasons. Each had its own personality, its own specific challenge, its own contribution to the overall history of what Brian and Stewie could do together. Road to Rhode Island's emotional achievement. Brian's discovery of his mother, Stewie's presence with him in the grief of that discovery was established in the show's second season, which meant the Road to format was carrying significant emotional freight from its very first installment. It was not beginning as light comedy and developing depth over time. It arrived with depth already present, which set the standard for every subsequent episode. Road to Europe's achievement was structural ambition in a literal sense. They went further, they encountered more different places. The journey required more from both characters in terms of flexibility and improvisation. The comedy of the Middle East sequence, the hot air balloon over Rome, the Amsterdam interlude, each section had its own specific comedy rather than a generic, "they're somewhere foreign" quality. The show had thought specifically about each location and what would be funny there, rather than using location as interchangeable backdrop. Road to Rupert's achievement was emotional precision. The premise was simple. The stakes were specific. The resolution was earned rather than explained. Stewie wanted Rupert back. Brian got Rupert back. The show trusted that the simplicity of this was enough, which it was, because the simplicity had been built from genuine emotional foundations rather than convenience. Road to Germany's achievement was tonal courage. The show took the format into the darkest possible setting, maintained the comedy without diminishing the weight of the historical context, and produced an episode that was different from every other episode in the series. The darkness of 1939 Europe was not used for shock. It was used as genuine stakes, as the thing that made the stakes of the episode real rather than abstract. Road to the North Pole's achievement was scale. An hour-long episode, a fully realized alternate version of Christmas mythology, an original song that was genuinely musically accomplished, a dark comedy about exhaustion and impossible workloads that managed to be actually funny while being actually true about its subject. Road to the Multiverse's achievement was visual ambition. The commitment to actually animating each universe in its universe's own style, rather than simply gesturing at the concept, elevated what could have been a series of visual jokes into something that felt like genuine creative labor. The episode showed what the show's production team could do when they were given a brief that required solving problems rather than executing the established format. Roads to Vegas's achievement was structural invention within the format. Using teleportation clones to produce two simultaneous versions of the story, one in which Brian and Stewie had all the luck, and one in which they had none, was a mechanical comedy idea executed with enough precision that the two stories remained distinct and interesting rather than blurring into each other. The lack of a musical number was a real absence, because the musical numbers had become load-bearing elements of the format's emotional architecture by this point. Road to India's achievement was character honesty. Brian's romantic idealization of Padma, the gap between who he imagined her to be and who she actually was, the recognition of the pattern without the ability to immediately change it, these were honest observations about a consistent character quality that the show had spent seasons establishing. What connected all of these episodes, beyond the formal elements of the format, was the commitment to giving Brian and Stewie time to be together, time to talk, to argue, to navigate something that was genuinely difficult, to discover things about each other that regular episodes' pacing did not create room for. The Road to format was protective time carved out of the show's usual structure, specifically for these two characters to be what they were best at being together. Section 6. Expanded. Meg's story, the full account. Meg Griffin's story is not just about abuse. It is about the specific experience of being the person in a group who absorbs what the group cannot process. Every social system, every family, every workplace has this person, the one who carries a disproportionate amount of the ambient difficulty, who serves as the target for displaced aggression and displaced anxiety, who enables the rest of the system to function by being the pressure valve. Meg was Family Guy's version of this structural role, and the show spent many seasons both creating the role and failing to notice what it was creating. The specific qualities that made Meg the obvious candidate for this role in the Griffin family were, paradoxically, exactly the qualities that should have made the role impossible to sustain against her. She cared. She wanted to be loved. She was sensitive to how she was being treated and affected by it in ways she did not fully conceal. In a family full of people who were, in different ways, defended against feeling things too directly, Peter through the density of his optimism, Lois through the structures of competence she had built, Chris through the gentleness that kept him slightly distant from the emotional weather around him, Stewie through the elaborate theatrical machinery of his persona, Brian through the ironic distance of his intelligence. Meg was the person who did not have reliable defenses. She was open to the world in ways that made her the path of least resistance for everything the world wanted to put somewhere. Her high school environment was a microcosm of the larger dynamic. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl, the social architect of James Woods Regional High School's hierarchy, took an active interest in Meg's position at the bottom of that hierarchy that went beyond the passive indifference of social exclusion into something more like deliberate maintenance. Connie needed Meg at the bottom, not consciously, not in any way she would have articulated if asked, but systemically. Meg at the bottom was part of what constituted Connie at the top. They were not simply opposed. They were interdependent in the way that any hierarchy requires both its peak and its base to maintain its structure. The episode where Connie and her friends were directly confronted, where the show actually brought Meg and her tormentors into a situation that forced a kind of reckoning, produced something more interesting than simple victory. Meg in those moments was not straightforwardly triumphant. She was someone who had been fighting for a long time and was tired and still fighting, and the victory, when it came, was real but not clean. The show understood that vindication after sustained mistreatment is more complicated than satisfaction. It tends to come with the recognition of how much time was spent getting there. Meg's relationship with her own talent, with the things she was actually good at, as distinct from the things she was told she was bad at, was one of the show's most underexplored territories. The saxophone storyline in The Simpsons crossover established that she had genuine musical ability. Various other episodes established intelligence, toughness, and a specific emotional perceptiveness that the people around her rarely gave her credit for. The late-season episodes in which she became more active, more willing to fight back, more capable of organizing her response to threat, suggested what the character had always been capable of, and what different writing decisions in the earlier seasons might have allowed her to become sooner. Mila Kunis's performance across all of this deserves its own acknowledgement. She voiced Meg Griffin for over 20 years through material that ranged from episodes that gave the character nothing but the receiving end of cruelty to episodes that gave her room to be fully human. In both categories, and in everything between, the voice performance maintained the character's essential quality, the searching sincerity, the hope that kept returning despite the evidence against it, the specific resilience of someone who had been knocked down enough times to have become quite good at getting back up. Section 8 expanded. The Drunken Clam Crew. More stories. The episodes that placed the Drunken Clam group at the center of a sustained adventure were among the show's most tonally unified. When all four men were together in a situation that required them to operate as a unit, the show could rely on character chemistry that had been built across seasons to do a significant portion of the comedic work without establishing it from scratch. The group knew how to be funny with each other because the group had been funny with each other for years, and the audience knew how they worked with each other because the audience had been watching. The New Orleans road trip in Cool Hand Peter was the most complete expression of the four-person group adventure format. The episode understood that putting four specific men in a Louisiana prison required each of them to bring something specific to the escape plan, not in a generic heist movie way where each character has a labeled skill, but in the way that people who know each other well operate together under pressure. They argued. They disagreed about the right approach. They were individually ridiculous in their characteristic ways. And they got out. The trip to the Middle East in a later season prompted by various misunderstandings that had escalated beyond what any of them had anticipated, had a different quality. The comedy of four men who were completely out of their depth in an environment that none of their existing knowledge had prepared them for, and who were managing this through the specific combination of improvisational confidence and fundamental incompetence that their friendship had always run on. Quagmire's relationships with the other three had a specific texture in each case. With Peter, there was the long-established warmth of genuine friends who had been through a significant amount together and whose friendship had accumulated enough history to be resilient against individual incidents. With Joe, there was the more complicated dynamic of two people who had both served Quagmire in the Navy, Joe as a police officer and who shared a certain professional understanding that the other two did not have access to. With Cleveland, before his departure, there was a gentleness that reflected Cleveland's own gentleness, a relationship that had fewer sharp edges than either of Quagmire's other male friendships. Joe's relationships with the group had the added complexity of his professional role. He was a police officer. Peter committed crimes in his vicinity on a regular basis, not serious crimes, but the kind of ongoing casual lawbreaking that a police officer who is also a close friend has to actively manage not to notice. The show occasionally addressed this directly, but more often treated it as a feature of the relationship rather than a contradiction within it. Joe was a good cop. He was also Peter's friend. These were two true things that coexisted in a state of permanent tension that both parties had agreed, without discussing it, to manage rather than resolve. Section 9 expanded emotional episodes, more cases. The show's catalog of genuinely emotional episodes is richer than its reputation suggests. And understanding what made these episodes work requires examining not just the content, but the structure, the specific choices about pacing and restraint, and trust in the audience that allowed the emotional content to register, without being forced. The episode grounded Charlie Brown. From a later season, there was not primarily an emotional episode, it was primarily a comedy about the Peanuts franchise being placed in the real-world consequences that its stories always avoided. But it contained a moment of genuine feeling in Brian and Stewie's discussion of what it meant to be a character who never grew up, who was always reset to the beginning, who could not carry their experiences forward in the way that real people carry their experiences forward. This was meta-commentary on the show itself as much as on Peanuts, and the show knew it, and the self-awareness made the moment more resonant rather than less. The episode Saving Private Brian, from Season 5, sent Brian and Stewie to the military together, and the experience, the genuine difficulty of what the military required of them physically and psychologically, produced an episode that had more weight than its initial premise suggested. Brian, who had not expected to find anything in the military experience beyond inconvenience and comedy, found something that affected him genuinely. The show let that effect be real. The Father Lives storyline, built across multiple episodes in later seasons, addressed Peter's relationship with legacy and with the question of what he wanted to leave behind him. These were not questions Peter typically asked himself. They required a kind of self-reflection that was not his natural mode, and the episodes that forced the question produced Peter at his most unexpectedly serious. He had opinions about what mattered. He had, underneath everything, a sense of what he hoped for the people he loved. He could not always find the words for it, but the episodes that gave him the space to try showed that the feeling was there, functional and real. The running emotional thread of Stewie's identity across the post-Evil Genius seasons, the episodes in which he navigated questions about who he was, what he wanted, how he understood himself in relation to the world around him, was the show's most sustained, ongoing emotional project in its middle and later seasons. These episodes were uneven in quality, but taken as a series they constituted a genuine character arc. A person, however strange his origins and circumstances, working out who he was going to be. The evil genius baby who had always known exactly what he wanted: domination, specifically Lois's death, specifically the world's subjugation, became someone who was less certain and, arguably, more interesting for the uncertainty. Section 10. Expanded. More obsessions, a deeper inventory. Peter's relationship with fame and celebrity was a consistent undercurrent across the show's run. He was drawn to famous people with the specific intensity of someone who understood fame as evidence of quality rather than simply as evidence of visibility. When a celebrity appeared in his vicinity, Peter's response was rarely the practiced casualness of someone who was comfortable in proximity to fame. It was the genuine excitement of someone who found the celebrity's presence meaningful. This made him an unreliable judge of what fame actually meant. since fame is a notoriously poor indicator of worth. The celebrities the show placed in Peter's vicinity ran the entire quality spectrum, from people who were famous for genuine accomplishment to people who were famous in the specific late-night television way that fame sometimes operates, which is to say, for reasons that were not entirely clear even to the famous person. Peter treated them all with the same reverence, which was itself a kind of comedy, the indiscriminate quality of his admiration making it something other than a reliable endorsement. His obsession with specific decades of American popular culture, the 1970s and 1980s specifically, was expressed through his relationship with the specific artifacts of those eras. The television shows, the movies, the music, the cultural moments that he could reference by name and with the precision of someone who had absorbed them at an age when everything was absorbed with maximum intensity. This is nostalgia in its purest form. Not the soft-focused sentimentality that nostalgia is sometimes accused of, but the specific, accurate memory of things that mattered to you at the age when things mattered most completely. Peter's references to the culture of his childhood were often funnier to the audience than they seemed to be to him, because to him they were not references but simply facts, the actual texture of a world he remembered and valued. His recurring fixation on specific local businesses, the particular bar, the particular restaurant, the specific physical spaces that constituted his geography was expressed through a kind of territorial loyalty that had no particular logic to it, but that was completely real as a behavioral fact. Peter had strong feelings about the right place to eat specific things. He had strong feelings about the right place to drink, obviously, and the Drunken Clam's dominance of his social geography was absolute. When circumstances placed him in alternative establishments, he experienced it as something that needed to be documented and reported to the appropriate parties. His relationship with authority specifically, with the forms of authority that he encountered in daily life without being accountable to in any professional sense, was one of the show's more consistent, ongoing observations. Peter respected authority in the abstract. He had a deep, almost instinctive deference to certain markers of authority: uniforms, titles, the specific language of official communication. But this deference was entirely separate from any willingness to actually comply with what the authority was asking. He would address the authority with total respect and then proceed to do exactly what he had planned to do before the authority appeared. The gap between the deference and the compliance was very wide, and the show used that gap consistently. Section 11 expanded. Surreal storylines, the deeper inventory. The show's investment in science fiction elements, the time travel, the alternate universes, the parallel timelines constituted an ongoing relationship with speculative fiction that was more substantive than the show's reputation as a pure gag machine suggested. The show used science fiction as a structural tool. The time machine specifically allowed it to revisit its own past, to comment on its own history, to place its current characters in dialogue with earlier versions of itself in ways that served both comedy and genuine reflection. The Back to the Pilot episode was the most direct version of this. Watching the current Brian and Stewie observing the original episode, the pilot, Death Has a Shadow, was watching the show turn its own history into material. The animation style differences between the original and the current production were visible and commented on. The characters that existed in the pilot were recognizable as earlier, different versions of the people the show had developed across a decade. The episode treated this self-observation as interesting rather than simply as an occasion for nostalgia, asking what it meant that these characters had changed and whether the changes were improvements or losses. The multiverse concept, as developed in Road to the Multiverse and subsequently elaborated in the video game Family Guy: Back to the Multiverse, gave the show an ongoing framework for considering alternatives to its established reality. The specific universes visited in the episode each said something about the show's relationship with its own assumptions. The Disney universe said something about the difference between the Family Guy aesthetic and the Disney aesthetic, and what was gained and lost in each. The dog-dominated universe said something about Brian's position in his own world. The Christianity-free advanced universe said something about the show's complicated relationship with religion as a topic. The Stewie kills Lois, Lois kills Stewie simulation, the Season 6 two-parter that served as a farewell to the original Stewie, was also a structural commentary on the show's own relationship with consequence. Stewie achieved his goals. The simulation showed what achieving his goals actually looked like, and the achievement was both satisfying and inadequate. He had what he wanted, and having it turned out not to be the same as being what he had expected it would make him. The simulation format allowed the show to play out this discovery without committing to it permanently, without actually killing Lois, without actually making Stewie a world dictator in the canon. It was a controlled experiment. But the results of the experiment were genuine. Section 12. Expanded. The Full Legacy. The show that premiered on the 31st of January 1999, following the Super Bowl, with 22 million people watching because the channel was already on that show, produced something that has persisted in the cultural memory with a tenacity that most television does not achieve. Not because it was perfect, because it was not. Not because it maintained a consistent level of quality, because it did not. But because it made something real, and real things have a different relationship to time than constructed things do. The characters of the Griffin household were real in the specific way that the best fictional characters are real. They had interiority that extended beyond what any individual episode showed. They had histories that shaped what they were doing in the present moment. They had futures that the show could gesture toward even without depicting. Brian's failed novel existed between episodes, as surely as it existed in episodes that mentioned it. Stewie's bedroom laboratory operated across the weeks between broadcast whether or not the camera was on it. The Drunken Clam booth was occupied on Tuesday nights even in the seasons where no episode showed it. The voices that animated these characters, McFarlane's multiple roles, Borstein's Lois, Kunis's Meg, Green's Chris, Warburton's Joe were the specific sounds of specific people across specific relationships across a quarter-century of work. Voice actors develop a relationship with their characters through repetition that produces a quality of inhabitation that is different from what any single performance can achieve. By the show's later seasons, each of the main voice cast had been living in their character for long enough that the character was not a role they performed, but something closer to a second self, a parallel person with a parallel history that intersected with the actor's own life. At every point the microphone was on. The world of Quahog will persist as long as the show persists, and the show is guaranteed to run through its 30th anniversary. It will continue to be produced, watched, argued about, quoted, and returned to by people who grew up with it. It will continue to be discovered by people who are encountering it for the first time and finding, in its particular combination of chaos and warmth, something that the long form of its history has made richer than any individual episode could have. 30 years of a talking dog who wanted to matter. 30 years of an evil genius baby who became something more complicated than a villain. 30 years of a man who caused more property damage than most natural disasters and who, at the end of each episode, came home. 30 years of Spooner Street and the Drunken Clam and the expired coupon that started a war. You can close your eyes now. The town is quiet. The clam is closed. The time machine is dark. Stewie is asleep, which is the only time that Stewie is truly not planning anything. Brian is somewhere comfortable with something to read. Peter is exactly where he should be. Everything will still be there when you wake up. If this worked for you, if the slow, detailed, story-based format of this channel is something you come back to subscribe, leave a comment with where you are and when you're listening. I genuinely love knowing where these end up in the world. Take care of yourselves. Good night. Fall asleep to Crazy Family Guy Storylines V3.0 script complete. Bonus section. The show's greatest one-off characters and guest appearances. Every long-running show accumulates, over the course of its years, a collection of characters who appeared in 1 or 2 episodes and left impressions disproportionate to their screen time. Family Guy has more of these than most shows, partly because its format, the episodic adventure, the specific situation of the week naturally generated situations that required new characters, and partly because the show had the creative and casting resources to make those one-off characters genuinely memorable rather than simply functional. James Woods is the most extended of these, having appeared in multiple episodes and developed into something closer to a recurring character than a true one-off. The show's version of James Woods bore an uncertain relationship to the actual James Woods. He had the same name, the same physical appearance, the same general professional context, but a personality shaped entirely by what the show found useful about him in any given episode. He was vain, impulsive, capable of being manipulated through surprisingly simple means, and sufficiently self-aware of his own nature to be entertaining company even when the specific thing he was doing was objectively terrible. The episodes in which Peter and James Woods had extended interactions were among the show's more reliable platforms for a specific kind of social comedy, the comedy of two people who should not be friends but are, who operate on completely incompatible logics but somehow manage to share enough of the same world to keep encountering each other. Adam West's Mayor of Quahog was the show's greatest supporting character achievement, and what made it work was the specific quality of commitment that Adam West brought to it. He was playing a version of himself. The character was named Adam West. The show never pretended otherwise. But the version he was playing operated according to an internal logic that had almost no connection to the logic of any sane municipal government. He made decisions that reflected concerns no voter had raised, about issues no one else had identified as issues, through processes that bore no resemblance to any established governmental procedure. He announced these decisions with complete confidence. He implemented them, or attempted to implement them, with genuine enthusiasm, and the city of Quahog continued to exist, which suggested either that the mayor's decisions had no consequences or that the city was more resilient than anyone had reason to believe. West's death in 2017 ended the run of the character, and the show handled the retirement of Adam West, the character, with enough care to suggest that everyone involved understood what the loss of the role meant. The specific comedic register that Mayor West had occupied, the gentle, confident surrealism of a figure of authority who was operating from an entirely private set of premises, was not replaced. It was simply acknowledged as gone, and the show moved on. The recurring news team at Quahog 5 News, Tom Tucker, the anchor, Diane Simmons, his co-anchor before her permanent departure, Trisha Takanawa, the field reporter, Ollie Williams, the weather correspondent, constituted one of the show's most effective ongoing satirical constructs. The news team existed as a target for media satire that was sharp in the early seasons and more variable in quality as the show continued, but that at its best captured something specific about the relationship between local television news and the communities it purported to serve. Tom Tucker was the fullest realization of a particular archetype, the regional television personality whose sense of professional dignity exceeded any reasonable assessment of what regional television news actually was. He was pompous in the specific way that pomposity looks when it has no institutional justification, all the mannerisms, and none of the underlying substance that would make the mannerisms appropriate. The Goldman family, Mort, the pharmacist, Muriel, his wife before her death, and then there were fewer, and Neil, their son, occupied a specific niche in the show's supporting ecosystem. Mort was the designated anxious character, the person whose responses to any situation were calibrated to the maximum possible expression of worry. This made him both a reliable source of a specific kind of comedy and an occasionally useful foil for storylines that needed a character whose anxiety could be made to seem, by contrast, more reasonable than the situation warranted. Neil Goldman, who had a persistent and completely unrequited romantic fixation on Meg, was one of the show's quieter running jokes. The person who was in Meg's position in the social hierarchy, but whose position there was in pursuit of someone who was in a worse position than him, which created a specific kind of comedy about the relative nature of social standing. Cleveland Brown's family unit, Cleveland, his son Cleveland Jr., his new wife Donna, and her children Roberta and Rollo were developed primarily in the Cleveland show, but brought elements of that development back to Family Guy after Cleveland's return. Cleveland Jr., in particular, was a character who the Cleveland show had made more specific and interesting than his brief appearances in Family Guy had suggested he could be. The development of Cleveland Jr.'s personality during the Cleveland show period gave his subsequent appearances in Family Guy more texture than his original appearances had carried. Bonnie Swanson's evolution across the show's run was one of the more interesting secondary character arcs in the supporting cast. She began as a background character, Joe's pregnant wife, perpetually and improbably pregnant for several seasons, and developed, particularly in the later seasons, into someone with her own agency and her own set of complications. The revelation that Bonnie had genuinely complicated feelings about her marriage, that she had her own needs and frustrations and desires that the show had mostly treated as negligible up to that point, reframed her history somewhat. She had been there all along. The show had simply not looked at her directly. Bonus section: the show's relationship with music. Family Guy's use of music, both original compositions and licensed recordings, was one of the show's most distinctive and most frequently underestimated qualities. The show was, in its DNA, musical in ways that went beyond the typical animated sitcom's use of background scoring. McFarlane's background gave him genuine musical capability that the show deployed consistently. He was a trained singer who performed in the big band and jazz standards tradition. He released multiple albums of this material across his career, and his facility with these genres informed the show's musical sensibility in ways that showed up both in the original songs written for specific episodes and in the show's curatorial relationship with the music it licensed. The Road to musical numbers were the most prominent expression of this musical investment. Each Road to episode featured original songs written specifically for the episode, performed by the voice cast, and arranged with production values that went beyond what the show's regular format required. Road to Rhode Island's title song used the melody of Road to Morocco, and created from that borrowed melody a new comic lyric that was structurally precise enough to work as comedy and musically accomplished enough to work as a song. Road to the North Pole's Christmas Time is Killing Us was dark comedy set to a melody and arrangement that could have existed as a genuine holiday song without its darkly comic lyrics, which is the highest compliment available to a comedic song, that it would survive the removal of the comedy. The My Drunken Irish Dad song, from the episode Peter's Two Dads, was a Celtic-influenced comedy number that managed to be genuinely affectionate about its subject while also being genuinely funny. The composition understood the specific music it was drawing from well enough to honor the form, even as it used the form for comic purposes. This is a quality that requires real musical knowledge, the ability to write in a style convincingly enough that the comedy comes from the content rather than from an approximation of the style. The show's recurring use of Broadway and musical theater material episodes that placed characters in situations that required full theatrical production numbers demonstrated the staff's facility with that specific tradition. The episode Something 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 Dark Side's Prom Night Dumpster Baby number, which appeared in a meta-contextual position within the Star Wars parody, was a piece of deliberate absurdism that worked because the actual song construction was solid enough to sustain the absurdity rather than simply asserting it. The Conway Twitty gag, which has been discussed at length in this script, was in its own way a musical tribute as much as a comedy bit. The songs chosen for the gag were not random Conway Twitty tracks. They were specific, chosen for their emotional content relative to the situation that the cutaway was being used to avoid addressing. Hello Darlin' appearing over Meg's abandonment at the altar was a choice that only worked if you knew the song well enough to understand what it was saying and how it related to what Peter was unable to say. The gag was smarter about music than it was given credit for. The show's use of licensed music in its regular episodes was similarly thoughtful more often than it was random. Songs appeared at specific moments, chosen for specific reasons, creating specific emotional effects that were different from what the dialogue or the animation could have produced independently. The show understood music as a storytelling tool, as something that added dimension rather than simply accompanying what was already happening. Bonus section: the show's cultural footprint and what it means. Family Guy's cultural footprint extends considerably beyond its direct viewership. The show produced phrases and references that entered the common vocabulary of internet culture in its early years, in the period when internet culture was still being established, and the things that went viral online were still surprising in their virality rather than expected. The early chicken fight clips circulated on Kazaa and LimeWire, and eventually on YouTube in the years when the show was between its cancellation and its revival, and those clips helped build the audience that eventually brought the show back. This is a remarkable fact in the history of television. A show that was canceled came back partly because its best moments were being shared without authorization through peer-to-peer networks, creating the audience that justified its renewal. The show's revival was, in a sense, the first major case of internet community advocacy, successfully changing a network's commercial decision. The phrases and references the show generated were specific enough to signal membership in the community of viewers who got them while remaining unclear enough to people who didn't watch the show. Giggity entered common parlance in a way that required some knowledge of the show's context to understand, but that was also recognizable enough in isolation to function as a general-purpose expression of enthusiasm. Without full context, Peter's various declarations, his assessment of The Godfather, his catchphrase variations, his specific expressions of physical pain traveled similarly. The show's influence on subsequent animated comedy is visible in how many shows attempted variations of its specific combination of cutaway gag structure, semi-serialized family sitcom, and willingness to go places that broadcast television typically avoided. The shows that followed Family Guy onto the adult animation landscape in the 2000s and 2010s owed something to what Family Guy had demonstrated was commercially and critically viable, even when they were doing something very different from what Family Guy was doing. It had expanded the space. McFarlane's subsequent projects, American Dad, The Cleveland Show, The Orville, various feature films all carried DNA from Family Guy in different forms. American Dad was the clearest case, both because it emerged from the same creative environment and because the show eventually became the strongest argument that the Family Guy approach, refined and freed from some of the habits that had accumulated in the parent show, could produce extraordinary work. American Dad's consistent quality in its later seasons, while Family Guy was navigating the ups and downs of its own run, was a demonstration that the format worked. The specific combination of character investment and comedic ambition that McFarlane had developed across his career worked when applied with consistent, creative attention. The show's relationship with its own audience shifted significantly between its original run, its Adult Swim rerun period, its revival, and its current status as a long-running institution. The audience that watched Season 1 was different from the audience that watched Season 8. The audience that discovered the show through Adult Swim reruns in the early 2000s was different from either. The audience that now streams the show on Hulu and watches new episodes on Wednesday nights is different again. Each wave of audience had its own relationship to the material, its own nostalgia for different eras, its own understanding of what the show was. The show's persistence across 30 years means that there are now adult viewers who watch the show as children, who have complicated feelings about what they watched then and what they think of it now, who have opinions about which seasons were good and which were bad, that are shaped by biographical facts, what age they were, what was happening in their lives, what the show meant in the context of when they encountered it. This is how long-running cultural objects work. They accumulate personal histories as well as broadcast histories. They become, for the people who grew up with them, something more than entertainment. They become part of the vocabulary of a specific time and a specific self that existed within that time. Spooner Street will be there, the Drunken Clam will be there. The Griffins will still be at number 31, still navigating whatever situation the week has delivered to them, still finding their way back to each other at the end of the episode. The chicken is still out there. Good night. End of script. Bonus section. The Griffin family's greatest holidays and special events. Every family has its rhythms of recurring events, the holidays, the anniversaries, the birthdays, the specific occasions that the calendar returns to reliably and that each return to with slightly more history accumulated than the last time. The Griffin family celebrated these occasions with the specific combination of genuine feeling and catastrophic execution that defined everything else about them, and the show's holiday episodes were among its most consistently enjoyable recurring format. Christmas was the holiday the show treated most seriously. Not in a reverent way, but in the way that the best Christmas episodes of any comedy treat the occasion. With awareness of what Christmas is supposed to be, and honesty about the gap between that aspiration and the reality of most families' actual Christmas experience. The show's most significant Christmas episode, Road to the North Pole, has been discussed at length elsewhere in this script. But the show's annual Christmas episodes, in the years when they were produced with the same attention the Road to format brought to them, had a quality of warmth that the regular episodes did not always achieve. The warmth came partly from the subject itself. Christmas, as a cultural object, carries an enormous amount of accumulated emotional weight that comedy can borrow, and partly from what the holiday episodes gave the characters permission to do. Christmas episodes could be sentimental in ways that regular episodes could not, because the audience accepted a certain degree of sentiment as part of the holiday package. They could be emotionally direct in ways that the show's standard register of irony and deflection typically prevented. And the show, when it was operating at its best in holiday mode, used that permission without abusing it. Thanksgiving episodes offered a different kind of opportunity. Thanksgiving in American culture is the holiday most associated with the specific dynamics of extended family, with the return of people who no longer live together, with the surfacing of old tensions and old grievances in the context of enforced proximity and compulsory celebration. The show used Thanksgiving episodes to put the Griffins in contact with the members of their extended family who did not appear in regular episodes: Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, Peter's relatives, Lois's relatives, and the result was a particular kind of social comedy that the regular show with its focus on Spooner Street could not generate. Carter Pewterschmidt at Thanksgiving dinner was one of the show's most reliable character vehicles in the holiday format. His relationship with Peter was formally hostile. He had disapproved of Peter since their first meeting and had never upgraded that assessment. But functionally, they were bound to each other through Lois in a way that required each of them to manage the relationship rather than simply end it. The management produced comedy in the specific mode of two people being polite to each other at a family dinner, while each of them was aware that the politeness was functional rather than genuine. Carter's wealth and his specific expression of that wealth, his casual dismissal of anything that was not at the standard his fortune could command, his willingness to use money as a solution to any problem, including problems that money could not actually solve, was a character quality. The show deployed more broadly in the holiday episodes than in regular storylines, where Carter's appearances were briefer and more targeted. Halloween episodes gave the show a specific visual and tonal register that it rarely used in other contexts. The show liked horror parody. It had a facility with the specific conventions of horror genre and an enthusiasm for applying those conventions to the Griffin family's particular brand of domesticity. The Halloween episodes also gave the characters permission to play against type in the costume context. Peter dressed as something that revealed a specific aspect of his self-image. Stewie's Halloween costumes being disproportionately elaborate and usually weapon-equipped, Meg's costumes expressing the gap between who she wanted to be seen as and who the world insisted on seeing. The show's treatment of Valentine's Day episodes centered primarily on Peter and Lois's relationship, which the holiday format gave the show an excuse to examine in more direct terms than the regular episodes typically required. What did Peter and Lois mean to each other? How had that meaning accumulated and changed across the years of their marriage? The Valentine's Day episodes asked these questions through the specific pressures that a romantic holiday placed on a couple, the expectation of romance, the difficulty of meeting that expectation when you had been married long enough that romance required active effort, rather than simply arising from the circumstances of newness. The anniversary episodes explored similar territory in a different key. Where Valentine's Day was about what Peter and Lois were currently to each other, anniversary episodes were about what they had been to each other and how that history had produced what they currently were. The show used these episodes to flash back to earlier periods of the Griffin marriage, the early dating period, the years before the children, specific moments that had shaped what their relationship had become, and the flashbacks created a kind of emotional depth that the regular episodic format, which always existed in an approximate present, could not produce. The births of significant new characters, the arrival of Susie Swanson after Bonnie's extended fictional pregnancy, the various children who appeared in the extended Griffin family network across the show's run were treated as genuine events rather than simply as plot developments. The show understood that births were turning points in the lives of the people they happened to, and it gave them the weight of turning points rather than simply the mechanics of plot advancement. Bonus section. The philosophy underneath the comedy. There is a tendency, when discussing long-running comedy shows, to treat the show's philosophical content as either non-existent or inadvertent, to say that the show was about being funny, and anything deeper than that was accidental. This tendency undervalues what the best episodes of Family Guy were doing, which was asking genuine questions about genuine things and using the comedy as a vehicle for the asking, rather than as a substitute for it. The show asked, consistently and in many different forms, what it meant to be a family. Not a perfect family. Not the kind of family that exists in aspirational depictions of domestic life, in which everyone is kind and thoughtful and the conflicts are resolvable through good communication and mutual respect. The specific kind of family that most families actually are, people who did not choose each other, who would not necessarily choose each other if given the option, who are bound to each other by accident of birth and circumstance, and the specific force of all the history that accumulates between people who have spent a lot of time in each other's company. The Griffin family loved each other in this sense, the sense of people who were stuck with each other and had, over time, made something meaningful of being stuck. The show asked what it meant to want to be more than you were. Brian's failed novel, Stewie's ambitions, Meg's persistent hope for recognition and belonging, Peter's occasional gestures towards something better than his ordinary life. These were all different expressions of the same underlying question. The show did not answer the question with optimism or with despair. It answered it with honesty. Wanting to be more than you were was painful and necessary and often unsuccessful, and the wanting itself was the thing that kept you human. The show asked what it meant to be loyal to people who were difficult to love. Peter and Lois's marriage, at its most honest, was about two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing and who continued to choose each other imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes badly across decades of experiences that should have, by any reasonable accounting, made the choice easier to walk away from. The loyalty was not sentimental, it was structural. It was the specific commitment of people who had built so much together that the thing they had built had its own weight, independent of the feeling that had originally motivated the construction. The show asked what comedy was for. This question lived underneath every episode, in the form of the choices the writers made about what to make funny and how to make it funny, and what to do when funny and true were in tension. The show answered this question differently in different seasons and in different episodes. Sometimes the answer was that comedy was for getting through things that were genuinely difficult. Sometimes the answer was that comedy was for saying things that seriousness could not say without becoming unbearable. Sometimes the answer was that comedy was for its own sake, for the pleasure of craft, for the specific satisfaction of a joke that landed exactly where it was meant to land. And sometimes the answer was wrong. Sometimes the show made things funny that should not have been made funny. And the wrongness of that choice revealed something about the limits of the people making the choices. These are not small questions. They are the questions that the best art asks, in whatever form and through whatever vehicle. Family Guy asked them through the specific vehicle of an animated comedy about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family, which is perhaps not the vehicle most people would choose for philosophical inquiry. But the vehicle worked often enough and well enough to have earned its 30 years. The family is still there on Spooner Street, still asking, in their specific and improbable way, the questions that everyone asks, still getting most of the answers wrong, still showing up for each other anyway. That's the thing about families. They show up. Good night. Bonus section. Peter Griffin's Many Jobs, the Complete Record. Peter Griffin's employment history is one of the most inadvertently comprehensive records of working-class American professional experience that any television show has produced. And this is entirely because Peter never stayed in any job for long enough to stop being interesting in it. The Toy Factory years, as discussed previously, were the formative period. The happy-go-lucky Toy Factory was a place of relative innocence. The stakes were low, the work was tactile, the environment was structured enough to contain Peter's particular brand of chaos without being completely overwhelmed by it. His position there gave him colleagues who appeared intermittently and helped establish the world of his professional life as distinct from his domestic life, which is one of the things that keeps a character from becoming simply a function of their home environment. The brewery period was longer and more central to the show's sustained identity. Peter at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery was Peter in a professional environment that suited his personality in ways that the Toy Factory had not quite managed. The product was something he genuinely cared about. The work had enough tactile engagement to keep him occupied, and the professional hierarchy was loose enough that his consistent deviation from established procedures could be absorbed without constant institutional crisis. Between these two primary employment contexts, Peter cycled through a series of temporary or alternative professional situations that the show used as single-episode or short-arc material. He was briefly a fisherman, briefly a newspaper publisher, briefly a professional athlete, briefly a Hollywood producer of sorts, briefly a restaurant owner, briefly a reality television participant. Each of these situations gave the show a new professional environment to place Peter in, with its own cast of supporting characters, and its own set of rules that Peter would proceed to negotiate with his characteristic combination of enthusiasm and inattention. The restaurant he opened in one episode, the one that became the proximate cause of a chicken fight when Ernie confronted him. There was particularly interesting because it gave Peter both the position of owner and the position of cook, which meant the show could explore his relationship with food from a professional perspective that his domestic context did not provide. Peter cooking for other people, managing the gap between what he believed he was cooking and what he was actually producing, dealing with customer responses that did not match his expectations. These were all comedy territories that the restaurant setting opened up without requiring elaborate setup. The professional football episode gave Peter a brief career in professional sports that the show played for all the comedy available in the premise. A man of Peter's size and build and athletic background joining the New England Patriots was already absurd as a premise, The show's willingness to go further to place Tom Brady in the episode as himself, to stage the Shapoopy performance during an actual game, to let the absurdity of the premise develop to its natural extreme rather than pulling back toward reality, turned the episode from a comedy about professional sports into a comedy about the specific person that Peter Griffin was, which was always the more interesting comedy. His brief career as a journalist, in the episode where he became a media critic of sorts, demonstrated Peter's specific relationship with authority and expertise, his willingness to assert strong opinions in professional contexts without the professional background that would typically be required to give those opinions standing. Peter as a media critic was funnier than Peter as a media professional would have been, because the comedy came from the gap between the authority the role required and the authority Peter actually possessed. What emerges from the complete record of Peter's professional life is a picture of someone who was genuinely enthusiastic about working, who wanted to be somewhere, doing something, participating in the world in a productive way, but who brought to every professional situation the same unmodified self that he brought to everything else. He did not adapt to professional contexts. Professional contexts adapted to Peter, or they did not, and the outcome in either case was material. Bonus section. Stewie and Rupert, the deepest relationship. The relationship between Stewie Griffin and his stuffed bear Rupert is one of the show's most genuinely touching ongoing elements, and it is touching in a way that the show never over-explained or sentimentalized past the point of effectiveness. Rupert was a toy. He was a stuffed bear that Stewie had presumably had since very early infancy. He could not speak, could not move, could not respond in any physical way to anything that Stewie said to him. And Stewie loved him with a completeness and a sincerity that the show depicted without apology. This was the one relationship in Stewie's life that was entirely safe. Brian could be unpredictable. The rest of the Griffin family was either oblivious to him or unable to truly know him. His various schemes and professional relationships were, by definition, competitive and adversarial, but Rupert received everything Stewie could not give anyone else. The planning sessions that Stewie conducted with Rupert as his audience, the personal reflections, the expressions of feeling that the evil genius baby could not afford to make in front of anyone who might use them, all of this was given to Rupert, in the confidence that Rupert would keep it. When Road to Rupert sent Brian and Stewie to retrieve the bear after Brian accidentally sold him, the episode understood that what it was recovering was not just a toy. It was the specific object that held a specific part of Stewie's interior life. The urgency of the retrieval mission reflected the real stakes of the loss, not the economic or practical stakes, but the emotional ones. Stewie without Rupert was Stewie without his one fully private relationship, and that absence was not something the show played as a joke. Brian's destruction of Rupert in a later season drunk, impatient with Stewie's treatment of the bear as a real entity, chewing the bear to pieces was depicted as genuinely cruel in the way that attacking someone's private comfort object is genuinely cruel. The show knew what it was depicting. It was depicting Brian, in one of his worst moments, destroying something that mattered to Stewie in a fundamental way. The episode did not entirely redeem the action, and Brian's subsequent guilt was proportionate to what he had done. The replacements and restorations of Rupert across the show's run tracked something about Stewie's development. In the early seasons, Rupert's importance was presented as simply a character fact. Stewie loved the bear went everywhere with Stewie, the love was total and unquestioned. In the later seasons, as Stewie became more emotionally complex, his relationship with Rupert became more complicated, more self-aware, more ambivalent at times, but never finally relinquished. Even as Stewie developed towards something more like emotional maturity, the bear remained. Some things are held on to not because they are necessary, but because they are true. Bonus section. The show's commentary on American culture. Family Guy was, from its first season, engaged with the specific texture of late 20th and early 21st century American life, in ways that its surface of absurdism sometimes obscured. The show was set in a specific socioeconomic context: working class, New England, brewery employment, a house that required constant maintenance and never quite got it, and it took that context seriously as the environment that produced the humor rather than simply as backdrop. Peter's relationship to American working-class culture was the show's most sustained piece of cultural observation. He watched specific kinds of television. He drank specific kinds of beer. He had specific relationships to professional sports teams and to the mythology that professional sports teams generate around themselves for their fans. He navigated specific institutional contexts, hospitals, schools, government offices, workplaces in specific ways that reflected specific forms of working-class American experience. He encountered specific kinds of authority and responded to them in specific ways that were recognizable as responses rather than as generic reactions. The show's engagement with American food culture ran through Peter's character with a consistency that reflected genuine observation. The specific foods he loved, the specific restaurants he went to, the specific relationship between food and occasion that governed his eating. These details built a picture of a person embedded in a specific cultural context with specific tastes that had been formed by specific experiences. Fast food, bar food, the particular cuisines available in a mid-sized Rhode Island city, these were not random but specific, and the specificity was part of what made Peter feel real. The show's commentary on American media, on television, on news, on the celebrity culture that both produced and was produced by the media ecosystem, ran throughout its entire run in various forms. Tom Tucker's news anchor character was media satire. The show's treatment of celebrity guest appearances was media satire. Peter's relationship with television as an object of devotion was media commentary. The show was always at some level a show about the experience of being a person in a media-saturated culture, about what it meant to have your understanding of the world shaped by the specific combination of television, film, popular music, and celebrity news that the late 20th century American media environment produced. What made this commentary effective, when it was effective, was that the show did not stand outside the culture it was commenting on. It was inside it. Peter loved television in the way that the show's audience loved television. His references were their references. His specific enthusiasms and his specific blind spots were recognizable because they were produced by the same media ecosystem that had produced the audience's enthusiasms and blind spots. The show was not critique from above. It was recognition from within, which is the harder comedy to write and the more honest one. The show's treatment of American suburban geography, the specific look and feel of the neighborhood, the shopping centers and chain restaurants and strip malls that constitute the landscape of middle-class American life, was embedded in the visual design in ways that the animation made visible. Quahog had the specific blandness of American suburban development mixed with the specific eccentricity of New England character, and the combination felt right in a way that purely generic American suburb would not have. The show knew where it was set and why being set there mattered for what it was trying to do. All of this is to say that Family Guy was underneath its absurdism and its cutaway gags and its giant chicken fights and its evil genius baby, a show about a specific time and place in American life. The time was the turn of the millennium and the years following it. The place was the specific geography and the specific cultural landscape of working-class northeastern America, and the people were people who lived in that time and place with the full complement of human feeling: love, frustration, ambition, disappointment, loyalty, betrayal, and the persistent sense that things could be better even if it was not entirely clear how that the time and the place and the human condition between them produce. That is what the show was made from. That is why it has lasted. Good night, wherever you are.